Chapter 1833. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:37 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1833. Young man, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1833. Young man, representations of Lionel's light half of the Northern Star lineage factor on my Instagram. Smiley face at @spec__. Lionel left the Skies family in a semi-foul mood. The morning of the Skies people left him with a sour taste in his mouth that he had expected. He seemed to be feeling something beyond him, but it wouldn't be until years from now that Lionel understood where this bitterness was coming from, much the same way it would be a long while before he understood where his love of Aina came from. In this very same foul mood, Lionel crossed the universe and appeared above the Oryx's territory. The race of people were quite secluded. They lived on just a single planet in a barren solar system, completely out of the way of others. Due to the circumstances, it was almost too easy for them to spot Lionel's arrival. Maybe it was due to his mood, but Lionel even somewhat hoped that the Oryx would resist. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately in most respects, that didn't come to be. Elther's words to his father seemed to have struck a chord. This time, when Lionel stood before the Oryx King, the latter had a hint of respect in his eyes that had never been there before. Even now, the Oryx King couldn't fathom how Lionel had ignored such temptation, but if there was a chance to be taken, it made sense for him to take it on Lionel. The Oryx King didn't expect the conditions to be as smooth sailing as they were in the past. He could understand this concept quite well. However, when Lionel finished laying out his conditions, he still couldn't help but sigh. Most of them were fine, but the final one left the most bitter taste in his mouth. Lionel wanted them all to move to Earth and become official citizens. Once they did that, he would allow bygones to remain bygones. With that move, much of the comfort and calm lives the Oryx had been granted would be over. King Oryx really only had himself to blame for all of this. Lionel had wanted to treat them well and as one of his own, but what he received in return wasn't the mutual respect he had been expecting. Instead, he found rudeness, indifference, and although it was subtle, mockery. The various Oryx elders were not happy with Lionel's demands at all, but the Oryx King simply raised a hand to stop them all. I will accept your demands so long as my people can have a large city of our own. You can have the entire moon, Lionel said casually. He had recently raised the moon and all of its structures to the ground, but much like the recovery of a seventh-dimensional individual couldn't possibly compare to a third-dimensional one, so too was the case for seventh-dimensional worlds. By now, the moon had already recovered and was once again filled with lush forests and rushing waters. The only unfortunate part was that its wildlife had suffered a blow, though the most powerful of the land and sea creatures were most definitely still alive. Then I'll thank you in advance, King Oryx said with a slight hint of relief in his tone. This was better than what he had expected, and he had a feeling that Lionel had done things like this on purpose. You all can have half a month to prepare and move out. I will prepare everything in the meantime. The meeting was just as short as the one he had had with the Skies family. At a certain point, when you held enough strength in your hands, things became much easier. In the past, getting people to follow him was like pulling teeth. But now, Lionel had a solid base for himself, one that made him more than confident in facing and dealing with the world. %% As Lionel was beginning to feel much better and even quite confident, his number of enemies still seemed to be multiplying. This only seemed to be more of the case after Lionel began to assimilate one region after another, displaying efficiency the Ascension Empire had never displayed before and putting smiles on the faces of the ministers of Earth. In just a week, not only had Lionel assimilated the whole of the thrusting Skies sector, but within the three-pillar sector, over 60% of the galaxies had had their world spirits assimilated with Earth. Of course, the vast majority of this 60% came from the Umbra, Midas, Radix, and Flora families, which were considered quite powerful in the three-pillar sector. As for the remaining 40%, it was essentially entirely under the control of the Viola family that suddenly found itself surrounded by enemies from all sides. After this was completed, Lionel had a meeting with his grandfather about allowing some to have Earth citizenship. Lionel never asked his grandfather how he could skip over the 5-generation rule, nor did Emperor Fox seem to have any intention of explaining, but the two stubborn men surprisingly worked quite well together. Lionel granted the Oryx race full citizenship to Earth. Their current members gained about 50% of the blessings of Earth, while their next generation of children would gain all 100%. Lionel also set aside this blessing for the most loyal members of the Etching Metal organization, although they had yet to come out of seclusion, and also a few select geniuses of the Umbra, Midas, Radix and Florer. All the while, the suffocating pressure Richard and the Viola family were experiencing only increased day after day. Lionel didn't seem to be in a rush to crush Richard at all. His first move had caused the death of many of Richard's elites and crippled him of his allyships with the Chaotic Water Sector and the Thrusting Skies Sector. Now, Lionel was just silently chipping away at him, sealing off his path to resources, squeezing his business dry, suffocating his lines of communication. Just 2 months after Richard's attempted sneak attack on Earth's territory, he sat in his family's throne room with a tight grip on his arm rests. At that moment, the aura of the throne seemed to be far less imposing. He couldn't remember when it had all gone wrong. No, he could. The moment he killed Lionel, it seemed that things hadn't stopped going wrong. Although he didn't want to admit it, he was being outplayed by someone. And no matter how much he hated it, that someone seemed to be Lionel himself. Richard took a breath, controlling his breathing. He had gone through too much to lose like this. Far too much. Richard opened his eyes and someone had appeared before him without even his knowledge. However, he didn't seem surprised by the appearance of this person at all. If Lionel had been there, unlike Richard, he would have been very surprised. That was because the person standing before Richard was none other than Orinik, the very same young man that had overseen his selection on planet Luxnix and the very same young man who had tried to profit off of his and Aina's death in the Dwarven race zone. What this young man who probably should have been in the Void Palace was doing here of all places was something maybe only he and the unsurprised Richard were aware of. Chapter 1834. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1834. Endure. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1834. Endure, you're here. Richard said lightly. Orinik gently patted down the slight wrinkles in his clothing. He was just as immaculately dressed as dressed, his robes looking like an evolved three-piece suit held together by a few chains of gold and silver. Even so, it didn't feel gaudy or nouveau riche. He carried the air of a refined gentleman, an air that was even sharper than it had been in the past now that he wasn't forced to wear the Void Palace's uniform. Orinik looked much the same as he had in the past, the only difference being that he now had a beard, which was of course perfectly groomed. What was interesting, though, was that his beard had neat strands of silver hair, a nice contrast to his dark skin. This was odd, though, since he didn't seem to have aged at the same rate as Richard. He seemed to be the same youth he was in the past. If I didn't come, wouldn't you have ruined everything? Orinik asked lightly. Richard wasn't enraged by these words, or maybe it just took more than this alone to enrage him. If you can point out to me where I've ruined everything, would actually very much appreciate it. Even now, I'm not sure where things went wrong, Richard replied. Isn't it obvious to you yet? You've been played. By who? By who else? Lionel Morales. Richard's gaze narrowed and he looked toward Orinik deeply. Explain. He eventually asked. You showed your hand too early. You're not as detached from this as you thought. If you wanted a chance for a sneak attack to work, then you should have let him trample all over you during his visit. There are no information networks that are infallible. If they hadn't been specifically looking for signs of your action because you led them like calves to the river to exactly what they needed, things wouldn't have happened like this. Or at the very least, your losses wouldn't have been so devastating. And how does the destruction of the chaotic water sector fall into all of this? Richard asked. This is something we still don't have the whole picture on, but the information released by Shield Cross Stars should be at least semi-accurate. It's just unlucky. They were destroyed before we could make use of them properly, but this is also a favor to us. The variables in Earth's territory are now at a minimum. Richard's gaze narrowed. You knew that they were of the cloud race. Not completely, but we had our speculations. Regardless, since they weren't part of the cause, they were destined to be destroyed. They were part of the previous world order, they're part of the very system that deserves to be taken down. That Guerrero's character didn't hesitate to sacrifice one of his own sons for the sake of power. What right does he have to be one of us? Orinic's expression was placid, but the sneer seemed to be clear in his voice. Then what do you want to do, exactly? We wait, Orinik said coldly. Very soon, Earth won't be able to deal properly with its own internal struggles. Richard's gaze narrowed. Weren't they destroyed? Those 4 families aren't as simple as they seem. In the Cataclysm Zone, the region I went to was under the control of the Lavis family. There's something very fishy about all of this. Those 4 families might not be human at all. Richard's pupils constricted. Not human? Not human may not be the correct way to say it. They may not be humans of our human domain is a more accurate statement. After saying this, Orinik turned and began to leave. Endure for now. Very soon, you won't have to endure any more enduring. Richard watched as Orinik vanished without a word. He too had heard inklings of those 4 families in the Cataclysm Zone. His assumption had always been that it was zone was a marker of the end times of the human domain, a zone demarking a future where those 4 families took precedence, a zone where, much like terrain of the path, it was created to give them an opportunity to survive. This assumption seemed perfect to him, especially since the human domain was facing threats from other races. The Cloud race had already infiltrated so deeply and the others were only waiting for their opportunity to pounce. But Orinik's conclusion seemed to be different. Of them all. For some reason. Orinik seemed to he the most mysterious for reasons he couldn't net his finger on. Although Orinik had come from a family much stronger than the Viola, in the grand scheme of the human domain, they were nothing more than ants, being even weaker than the current thrusting skies sector or the former chaotic water sector. Even so, upon his return, Orinik had elevated the status of his family even faster than he had. Richard had been convinced that no one could have gained from the Cataclysm generation more than he had, but then he met Orinik. And now, Lionel seemed to have returned with a vengeance and had, according to Orinik, been leading him by the nose. Endure, huh? He had already been enduring for almost 3 decades, even a few more months wasn't a big deal to him. All he had to do was be ready when the time came. Unfortunately for Richard, Orinik wasn't the only intelligent man in existence. Lionel had known weeks ago that he had yet to destroy those 4 families completely and he knew what kind of danger they posed. So why would he let Richard survive for longer than he had to? Just when Richard thought that Lionel might try to suffocate him to death, a month later, an all-out war erupted, executing a sneak attack Richard could only dream of. In a single half-night, half of Richard's territory vanished and another quarter was swallowed up as he commanded a tactical retreat. By morning, only the 3-pillar galaxy remained. Chapter 1835. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1835. Bitter if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1835. Bitter. Lionel stood on the bow of the flagship, his gaze cold. He had yet to step onto the battlefield, all he had done was direct, and yet he without a doubt had the most blood on his hands. His commands were incisive, and often outright cruel to his enemies. A tactician who could envision a battlefield that spanned across several galaxies was definitely not one to be trifled with, and that was precisely the kind of commander that Lionel was. Whether it was on the micro level or the macro level, he took it all into account. He could avoid detrimental battlefields on scales as small as individual cities, and seek out positive battle situations on scales as large as the galaxies themselves with ease. Usually, commanders would have to delegate tasks, trusting those under them to deal with these small-scale matters. But Lionel had taken it all on his shoulders and he didn't seem to be flustered in the slightest. In fact, he seemed to still have time to enjoy the scenery around him as his nigh countless split minds all dealt with individual tasks of their own, sending information across light years. Richard sat in his throne room with his hands tightly holding onto his throne's armrests. These days, he seemed to be facing greater and greater issues with maintaining his usual calm. Before he had met Lionel and Aina, he had always been a calm and calculating individual. It was only after meeting them, and Aina in specific, that he began to lose his temper more and more frequently. And now, as though to rub this in, the moment they appeared in his life once again, it was happening once more. After a moment, Richard exhaled a breath. Every few minutes, he received reports of another loss. It was time that he joined the battlefield personally. Only like this would he be able to turn things around. But before he could step foot out of the throne room, he was blocked by a familiar figure. Richard met Orinic's gaze. "You enter and exit my territory with greater ease than even I do. Don't you have a family to manage?" Richard asked coldly. Orinik simply shook his head, but it was clear that he wasn't replying to Richard's question. He was taking a stance on Richard's previous actions. "You're asking me to not go and support my family?" Richard's gaze turned bloodshot. "Now isn't the time. You'll only be going out there to die. Individual power hardly means anything on a scale like this one unless you can fit all of your assets, family members, and allies onto just a single planet. Can you do it?" "I don't have to do that," Richard roared, his voice losing its calmness entirely. "All I have to do is kill that son of a bitch. While he's protected by a Tier 2 star flagship of Shield Cross stars? Do you like the idea of suicide that much?" Richard clenched his jaw. "You said I just had to endure. You said so long as I endured, I wouldn't have to endure any longer very soon. What are your words if not a useless pile of shit?" "My words are still the same as they were back just a month ago. Endure. We have miscalculated this matter and Lionel is a stronger opponent than we assumed him to be. Until you realize that the game has changed and some pawns have become kings, you will lose and continue to lose. Who would have thought that Lionel was returned now of all times? Not only that he would return, but even manage to steal such a weapon of war? And even worse than that, he would seemingly have returned with strength that was undefeatable within the 6th dimension and even have an ability that allowed him to battle against individuals of the 7th? Hearing these words, although Richard's eyes were still bloodshot, he was taking deep breaths. Indeed, the game had changed. Their original plans were made taking into account those 4 families and the pressure they put on Earth. But the moment Lionel had returned, he not only did so with a fierce momentum, but he directly wiped them out, destroying the knife Earth had pointed at their backs. On top of that, he seemed to now have an information network that placed the happenings of Earth's territory in the very palm of his hand. Almost nothing happened without his knowledge. "Retreat, Richard. I've prepared an escape pad for you. Take your closest remaining family members, the most elite of your people, and come with me." Richard remained silent for a long time before closing his eyes. Eyes still closed, he spoke. "This is what you've wanted from the very beginning, right? An ally as strong as you?" "Of course." Orinik replied lightly. "We were already allies," Richard replied. "What I mean is my lifeline being in the palm of your hands. Everything will be under your control from now on, right? If you want to see things that way, I can't stop you, Richard. But you should also understand that if you're under my leadership, not only will things run more smoothly, but I guarantee you will get your revenge, very soon, at that. In fact, the destruction of your family will only help. You cannot say that I did not give you a chance to do things on your own. I have been completely hands-off of Earth's territory and have allowed you to form alliances as you please. Have I ever tried to direct you or control what you've done?" Richard was silent because he knew that the answer was no. At least in this respect, Orinik was sincere. "You do not have to worry. I have a hatred for Lionel no deeper than yours, and soon, he'll also come to experience what it means to be trapped in a web of schemes he can't extricate himself from. The taste of his own medicine will be especially bitter." Richard clenched his fists and his jaw before he relaxed, his calm returned and the crimson fading from his eyes. "I will follow you." Chapter 1836. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1836. Trust me, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1836. Trust me. Lionel stood over the war-torn planet Viola with the very same indifferent expression, unmoved by it all. "He isn't here." These were the only thoughts Lionel had toward Richard since the start of this war. He hadn't taken the latter seriously at all. But he had predicted that there was a better than 80% likelihood that Richard would lose his temper and attempt one final all-out assault against him before he perished with the remains of his family. However, not only had Richard not done that, he seemed to have vanished without a trace. There were only two conclusions Lionel could see for this. Either Richard had evolved more as a man that he had initially given him credit for, or someone else had interfered. Almost as soon as he had these two thoughts, Lionel knew that it was the latter of the two. If he hadn't met Richard face to face already, he would have thought it to be the 30-70 toss-up, where the likelihood of the first option was 30%. But he had, so Lionel knew there was a better than 95% chance that it was the second option. The real question, though, was who would be able to steer Richard off of his path of murder and destruction. Just putting himself in Richard's shoes, Lionel knew that he would be livid. Richard had had his family destroyed once, but back then, the Luxniks had only attacked the main family branch, what meant that almost all of the Viola family's side branches had survived to live out suppressed existences. However, that had happened again, but this time in reverse, as Richard seemed to have escaped with most of his elites. In one way or another, his family had been forcefully suppressed twice over. Even a monk would find themselves at the end of their rope, let alone someone like Richard. To be talked down from a ledge, whoever this person was had to both be highly intelligent and highly respected by Richard. And, maybe most importantly, this person should be quite likely to have a close relationship with Richard. A woman? Less likely due to Richard's previous trauma related to these matters. He also didn't have a second throne in his throne room, so he's unlikely to have a wife, or at least a wife he deems to be his equal. A respected minister? Also unlikely. Those ministers of his blindly worshipped him, and they were almost all exceptionally young. If Richard said to run through a brick wall, they wouldn't hesitate. Those people wouldn't have the mind to ask him to turn around, and even if they did, Richard wouldn't listen to them. The only explanation then is that this person comes from outside of the Viola family, likely an ally or a friend, probably both given the circumstances. In that case, likely someone from the Void Palace, also likely someone who experienced similar to near identical circumstances as himself in the Cataclysm Zone. In that case, there's a better than 60% likelihood that this person is from a background that's not too powerful and also happens to have a world spirit that gave them an advantage within the Cataclysm Zone. Interesting. Lionel's gaze flickered and he turned to his right. Yuri, what families had the largest sudden boost in recent times? Yuri blinked, clearly not expecting for Lionel to suddenly ask her such a question. There are a lot. But if you mean the ones who've displayed the most improvement, there's probably only 3 prominent ones. One is the Viola family. Yuri cast a glance toward the planet below them. The second is the Aemon family, and the last is the Itatsi family. Aemon and Itatsi? What do you know about them? Not much. They were fairly middle of the road in the past, and they're not exactly big shots now either. It's just that their improvement is disproportionate to the amount of time that has passed. They were formerly in the bottom rung of 7th dimensional sectors, now they're nearer the middle. Is that all? There's not much other than that. There might be even weaker families than that have had larger overall improvement, but no one pays much attention to the 6th dimension given the scales of things. Lionel nodded. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't know anything about Oranic's background, because if he had, he would have recognized the Itatsi last name as being Oranic's family name. Emna. Lionel called out. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared to Lionel's left like a bolt of lightning before a young woman stepped out from its midst. Yes. Emmen, the Aemon and Itatsi families. During the expansion, tell the higher-ups to focus on the 2 of them. Emna's brows raised. The etching metal organization was, indeed, preparing for expansion so that they could be properly prepared for the coming heirs' wars. But originally, they were going to focus on the larger fish. This sudden pivot was unexpected. Don't worry about it, Lionel said with a wave of his hand. I have a feeling that there won't be enough time for the organization to expand adequately enough to be useful in the heir wars. Emna's brows jumped again. Not enough time. The heirs' wars wouldn't start until Lionel entered the 7th dimension. No one would even blame Lionel if he purposely delayed a bit. Even the quickest estimate was a decade, although that was a bit of a time crunch, Emna was confident that as they became more powerful with Lionel's backing, they could do it even half that time if they really went all out. So why was Lionel saying this now? Lionel smiled and didn't explain. Just trust me. Okay. Emna nodded. When Emna vanished, so too did Lionel's smile. Yuri looked toward his side profile, wondering where the naive boy of back then went. Even as this conversation came to a close, news of the unification of Earth's sector spread like wildfire. There was simply no hiding it. Lionel had only just come back, and yet Earth's turmoil, or at the very least the worst of it, had been suppressed in less than a single year. The human domain was lit ablaze. Chapter 1837. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 32 seconds AM. Chapter 1837. Peace. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1837 Peace. Just 2 chapters today, but I will upload 3 on Saturday. Earth's territory had been in shambles for a long while, only for news of its sudden stabilization to spread like wildfire. No one had ever expected that the return of a 6th-dimensional prince would cause such commotion. When Noah heard the news, he could only smile somewhat bitterly. He had been back home for a long while already, but he had been entirely focused on increasing his own strength. He didn't believe that he was powerful enough to force Earth's territory into submission, so he had been trying his best to quickly reach that point. However, Lionel seemed to have flipped that notion on his head. When Noah last saw him, he was only at Tier 1, and yet he had already wiped out the 4 families. Now he was at Tier 3 and in just a few months had forced the Thrusting Skies sector to bend the knee and forced the Viola family out. If Noah knew that Lionel was also responsible for the destruction of the chaotic water sector as well, he might very well have to drink his sorrows away. He could still remember seeing Lionel that day. Despite having already stepped foot into the 7th dimension himself, he had still felt small. Maybe he really was too bogged down by tradition and doing things the right way. Lionel didn't seem to care about what made sense in the eyes of others, he simply acted to crush those who would deem to stand in his way. Noah could still remember that feeling of weakness after being captured as a slave by the people of that zone. If not for Lionel, who knows what would have happened to him? The impact of Miguel had been especially exaggerated. In fact, ever since their return to the human domain, Noah hadn't seen Miguel even once. It was impossible to tell where he had gone considering the vastness of the universe, but that was definitely a blight on his heart that he couldn't get rid of easily. The gap felt almost too large. Shield Cross stars had less complex feelings about this matter, mostly because there wasn't anything to feel other than rage. They had been booted out of Earth's territory, and just when they thought that Earth would suffer for their choice, what actually happened was its stabilization. With the contrast between the two states, how could they not be infuriated? Didn't this paint them out to be incompetent? What was even worse than this was that more and more every day, Cross Elder Avon kept getting the feeling that he was being forced to do someone else's dirty work. Guerrero's laughter at his expense still echoed in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized who benefited the most from the collapse of the chaotic water sector, and the more the image of that annoying, smiling brat appeared in his mind. He didn't want to believe it, he refused to believe it, and yet it would practically wake him up in his dreams. His temper became so poor that most simply began to avoid him entirely, and things only became worse when it became clear how difficult it would be to get any sort of information out of the Guerreros. Rather than dealing with the methods of Shield Cross stars, Guerreros simply entered a deep hibernation unique to their race, cutting off his senses from the world and burying his mind. Not only did this make him immune to torture since he couldn't feel anything, it also made probing and reading his mind nigh impossible due to the complex maze that was the Cloud race's cloud figure. The only drawback of this hibernation state was the fact that Guerreros could only rely on another member of his race to wake him up, as he couldn't do so naturally. But even so, he chose to take this route without hesitation, frustrating Avon to an extreme. This time, even the reinforced desks couldn't survive his wrath. In just a week, he went through 3 of them, each one worth tens of times the yearly revenue of a powerful 6th-dimensional city. Shield Cross stars weren't the only ones frustrated, the other sectors eyeing Earth's next expansion and the remaining territories within Earth's who knew they were next were all frustrated. They had thought that they could just sit on the sidelines and reap the benefits when the time came, but reality was often cruel. The systematic oppression they faced under Lionel's leadership was suffocating, and the most shocking part was that Earth's core armies never made a single move, still silently improving themselves in the main region of Earth's territory. Lionel utilized Shield Cross-Star's flagship and many somewhat lesser quality warriors to completely rout them, leaving them no chance for retaliation. There was simply nothing to take advantage of, and those that remained within Earth's territory knew that they would be next the moment Lionel finished consolidating everything in the three-pillar sector. However, to their surprise, after crushing the rest of the Viola family's opposition and swallowing up their territories, Lionel came to a full and complete stop. Those watching from the sidelines felt their hearts go cold upon seeing this. Naton Wei Ti, Enel Niino and Norfile Hit Hick Command of the Hattlefield Wei Neenlike and Fino Thu had ever seen Hefer Van Oak Tradia Siknften let their Nixis clan their judgment and often press too hard once they had gained an advantage, not realizing that it only took a single mistake to lose everything. Compared to others, Lionel had even more of a right to be cocky. He had subdued 2 entire sectors in just a few months. Why shouldn't he feel arrogant? And yet, despite having a clear and strategic advantage, and having the momentum necessary to stake a claim onto the rest of Earth's territory, he did nothing of the sort, pulling back and retreating into the darkness in complete silence as though nothing had happened at all. However, in that silence, what rang the loudest was peace. Chapter 1838. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1838, and yet. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1838 and yet. Lionel sat in silence, his thoughts unreadable. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or unsatisfied with what was going on around him despite the fact that it was a clear and undeniable victory on his part. In his mind, though, Lionel was quite unsatisfied. He didn't believe that there was anything to be happy about at all. As far as he was concerned, the moment he came back, this result was essentially inevitable. Was there a need to be happy or prideful about something that was guaranteed? It had been about half a month since the collapse of the Viola family and the etching metal organization had already begun to work on Lionel's asks. In fact, a preliminary report on those 2 families had already been given to Lionel and he had circled one very important thing. Head of the Itatsi family, Orinik Itatsi. It was a simple bit of information, one accessible to almost anyone even without such a large and robust information network. And yet, when Lionel saw it, his lip couldn't help but curl into a sneer. His relationship with Orinik couldn't be said to have started off with the latter being in the wrong. In the eyes of Orinik, Lionel was someone who had relied on his mother to gain a position that he didn't deserve, and that much was true. However, after stepping foot into the Void Palace, it was Orinik spreading this information that put the life of not only Lionel, but also Aina and the others in danger. Spreading it wasn't particularly the problem, the real issue stemmed from who he had spread it to. There was deliberate and malicious intent in his actions. Not long after that, Lionel and Aina entered the Dwarven race zone and Orinik once again took advantage of that situation in an attempt to make money off of their deaths. A choice he paid dearly for at the hands of Lionel. In reality, neither of these 2 things deserved death. Whether he had malicious intent in the first case or not didn't matter because if he chose to spread the information, it would have reached the ears of those people regardless. At the same time, when it came to the matters surrounding the Dwarven zone, just because it left a poor taste in Lionel's mouth, didn't mean that it was worthy of death either. Due to these reasons, Lionel had never really given Orinik much thought after he had gone through so much. He wasn't interested in dealing with such things anymore and he had bigger fish to fry. But to his surprise, Orinik insisted on becoming one of those bigger fish. Lionel flipped through the documents in just a few moments before setting them down. There was absolutely nothing special about them, but this was only the first round. It took time to lay down proper networks and communication paths. He didn't expect anything more than this at this stage. It should be about time that Anastasia finished. I'll see what I can find out about the Silver Empire's inheritance before the tribulation descends. When are you going to let me go? The voice knocked Lionel out of his state of focus. He looked to the side to find that Harmony had come to the bow of the ship. You want the serious answer? Lionel asked. Obviously. Harmony said, annoyed. It could be said that a large part of why Lionel was able to crush so many armies with relatively average talent was because he used harmony like his sharpest blade, sending her to all the most troublesome areas. She had done her job well, not that she had much of a choice. Okay. You can go after I destroy the three-finger cult. Harmony's pupils constricted. The murderous intent coming off of Lionel in waves suddenly made her realize that if it wasn't for the fact he owed her sister a favor, he really wouldn't have hesitated to slaughter her in cold blood. After a moment, Harmony exhaled a breath. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Even your father hasn't succeeded, let alone you. Lionel's aura receded and he chuckled as he stood to his feet. I don't know why that old man's dragging his feet, but I guarantee it has little to do with you all. There are larger things at play. I dare to say that no one in the universe can look my old man in the eye. Harmony frowned. Wasn't Lionel too confident about things he knew nothing about? But her skepticism made sense. She had heard all sorts of disparaging remarks about the so-called cowardly Velasco from the cult. In fact, the higher-ups seemed to go out of their way to be certain that everyone knew how little they respected him. You're talking nonsense. Am I? Lionel stretched out his hips, his lip curling into a smile. In that case, why don't you ask yourself the same question in reverse? After saying this, Lionel turned and left, leaving Harmony quite stunned. Indeed. Velasco was just one man while they were an entire organization. What pride was there in saying he couldn't take them down? Wasn't the real question to ask why it was that after all these years, they hadn't been able to kill him? Also, it wasn't as though Velasco's location was unknown. He had spent nearly 18 years, almost 2 decades, in the same spot, living in the same house, sitting on the same couch. He was entirely casual about his actions, and if he could figure out a method to enter a third-dimensional world with his strength, with the resources of the three-finger cult, why couldn't they? And yet, they hadn't even made an attempt to kill him in that time as far as Harmony was aware. During those 2 decades, Velasco couldn't practice, he had no force to absorb, no higher energies to meditate upon, no method of improvement. But they still did absolutely nothing to him. Harmony's gaze snapped back just in time to see Lionel's back view vanishing. For some reason, she felt as though her heart was pounding out of her chest. Chapter 1839. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1839. Symbiotic. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1839 Symbiotic. More chapters on the way. Just got a bit of a late start today, cough. Lionel entered the segmented cube and didn't disturb Anna. Instead, he went right to Anastasia to see what she might have found out about the inheritance until now. Quite frankly, he was quite curious. It wasn't just about the inheritance itself, but also its method of transferring its benefits. Lionel had only been in contact with a third of the inheritance for a small while, and yet it had permanently altered his heart size and shape without him even noticing. Methods on that level were far beyond Lionel's understanding. Even when it came to the tablet, Lionel could feel the transformation process, and there was even some pain involved, especially when the light and dark halves of his Northern Star lineage factor fused into one. For such sweeping changes to occur to him without even taking note of it, it was one part astonishing and another part somewhat scary. What if instead of benefits, the inheritance had been malicious? What if instead of improving the function of his heart, it added a permanent defect to it? Or what if it removed his heart entirely? These latter reasons were why Lionel chose to be cautious. If even his senses were useless in checking and monitoring the changes of this inheritance, then diving head first into it might very well be a mistake that he would never be able to extricate himself from. Any news? Lionel stepped into the lab to find a floating little girl. This inheritance is quite amazing. If what you said about the Silver Empire being a hotbed for demons was true, then this inheritance is probably the reason they were able to do it. Just taking on this inheritance would practically make someone immortal. Just the benefits of slowing your heartbeat alone would extend your life by as much as 10%. Anastasia didn't even look toward Lionel as she spoke, her gaze somewhat vacant. But Lionel was used to this. Unlike he who had to physically use the tools of the lab to get the results he wants, Anastasia was the lab and the lab was her. That vacant look in her was just her exercising her control over her surroundings, and that was made even clearer by the tools and flickering screens in the surroundings. Lionel didn't seem too surprised by Anastasia's words, though most of these were his guesses already. Plus, even back on third-dimensional Earth, the benefits of strengthening the heart and lowering one's resting heart rate were well documented. Anything groundbreaking? Everything is about what you would expect. The three parts of the inheritance come together to cause a qualitative change to the body, however the wood part of the inheritance caused the most obvious changes. More valves to the heart, larger sides, more folds in the lungs, more blood vessels, etc. The fire part of the inheritance allows you to swallow fire force and turn it into strength and vitality that support the wood part. The metal part allows you to transfer this vitality from yourself to other objects, namely metal objects, and if you're clever like the radix family, metal crafts. One part makes you a vessel. Another part strengthens the vessel. The last part allows you to share the strength of your vessel. No matter how you slice it, it's an auxiliary lineage factor designed for the express purpose of support, but what's odd is that it's not obvious at first glance what it's trying to support. The fire part makes sense, but the transfer to metal objects part feels entirely arbitrary. Why does the fire part make sense? Fire has and always will be the foundation of life. It was the first invention. Without its existence, without its warmth, there wouldn't be life as we know it. It could be said that it's even more fundamental in this regard than life force. Lionel frowned when he heard this. It sounded like some nonsense you would read in a book, or some legend about a man like Prometheus. But the way he saw it, the root of fire would always be destruction. It was designed to burn, to combust. Warmth came not from fire, but from the stars, and stars were decidedly not flames. They were nuclear reactors that took advantage of the exothermic output of volatile chemical reactions. Life could exist without fire, in fact existence might be better off without it in some respect. But it couldn't make do without stars. If Anastasia had said the same thing about water force, he would have tended to believe her a little bit more. But for fire force, one just needed to look at the number one fire force in all of existence to understand. How could the embodiment of destruction be the number one fire force in all of existence if fire force was the representation of life? It didn't compute. If I had to guess why metal was chosen, it's likely because its root is earth force. Earth force is a great stabilizing force and it can ensure balance. This ties in with the transferring of vitality quite well, as it won't allow your body to become overloaded with life force that you cannot handle. As such, it allows you to offload some of that weight to another VQYYYY8 object. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Metal as a stabilizing force. Hold on, earth force isn't necessarily entirely disconnected from life. There are real minerals and metals within the human body that have to reach a certain level to maintain one's health. Tron, zinc, copper, magnesium, sodium, the list goes on and on. Earth force is probably even more important to survival and life force than fire force could ever be. That sort of symbiotic relationship between organic and inorganic. Lionel's body trembled and he seemed to have comprehended something. His bronze aura triggered outside of his control, but the dazed look in his eyes made it clear and obvious that he didn't notice at all. Lionel's aura rose like a gentle tide, a far cry from the sudden burst he had experienced at the Umbra family. Even so, he crossed a major threshold, entering Tier 4. Chapter 1840. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1840, Slow and Steady? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1840 Slow and Steady? Lionel's progress was like a gentle tide, his aura like the warm embrace of the first rays of sun in the morning. The way Lionel looked at his divine armor and metal body felt different now. They didn't feel like extensions of himself granted by his lineage factor, rather they felt more like fundamental aspects of his being, and he even somewhat regretted how he had constructed them now. If he had this knowledge before, his approach would have been slightly different. However, unlike how he might have reacted to this in the past, Lionel didn't panic now and his usual feelings of missing out weren't there. That was because due to his new mindset, he was extraordinarily confident that he would be able to fix it. His divine armor and metal body weren't rigid, immovable constructs. They were him just as he was them. If one wanted to change the composition of metals in their body, there were all sorts of methods even a third-dimensional human could use, let alone Lionel, who was now in Tier 4 of the 6th dimension and had a lineage factor specifically tailored for this. Now, Lionel was even more certain that the lineage factor of the Morales family was tied with the lineage factor of the Silver Empire. He felt that Anastasia was correct. The lineage factor was preparing a person's body for something, and that something was the metal synergy lineage factor. He was over 70% certain of this. The only questions that remained were related to how things had come about like this. Why was the preparation lineage factor not in the hands of the Morales? With it, they would have the only 9th-dimensional lineage factor in the human domain, that was guaranteed, no one could convince otherwise. Even if by some anomaly Lionel was wrong and this inheritance wasn't designed to help the metal synergy lineage factor, the truth of the matter was that it would still raise the latter to the standard of a 9th-dimensional lineage factor whether they were related or not. The two were simply far too compatible. Then there were the other obvious questions. What was the relationship of the Morales with the Silver Empire? And no, even deeper than that, the Three-Finger Cult? Was this related to the death of his grandfather? He could feel that the demoness could sense him whenever he thought about her. It was the uncomfortable feeling of someone looking over his shoulder while he was trying to do work, scrutinizing his every action. If she wanted, Lionel felt that she could learn everything she wanted to learn about him in an instant, so why hadn't she done anything yet? Could it be that she wanted this inheritance to fall into his hands? Could she be indifferent to it all? Could it be that she was afraid to take action because of his father? Even for Lionel, he felt like he was getting a headache thinking about it. Nothing felt like it made sense. The jumbled mess of enemies, friends, frenemies, all seemed far too complex for even him to untangle. Lionel opened his eyes and exhaled. However, he was surprised to find that Anastasia was looking at him with a weird look in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Lionel asked. "People aren't supposed to be able to break through like that." "Like what? Isn't this how the 6th dimension works?" "My path isn't exactly like the God path, but it works similarly enough. So long as I comprehend my forces, I progress." "Yes, but it's not like that. You're making massive leaps in logic, accepting them easily, integrating them, and then breaking through in the blink of an eye. Normally, one needs to have an idea, affirm it, test it, then meditate on it for a few weeks to months before consolidating and then finally breaking through. The only person I've seen break through like you is that annoying man." Lionel grinned, already knowing she was talking about his old man. "What's even weirder is that you don't seem to be using the same forces to break through, and you also aren't using a cultivation method of any kind. You did the same thing through the 5th dimension too. You didn't even use dimensional cleanse until you needed to redo the 5th dimension and break through." Lionel raised an eyebrow. "How did you know that? You weren't there for that. My vessel is an extension of me. Although I wasn't there, my vessel was still on your finger the whole time. After I fused with it again, its memories also fused with me." "I see," Lionel said lightly. "Is there something wrong with what I'm doing?" "Not really, but it relies a lot on spontaneity, something that can't be relied on. If you don't learn to do things the slow way, it might come back to bite you, or you could be like that annoying man and never need the slow way anyway. Just now, if your comprehension of Earth Force didn't leapfrog your comprehension of Dream Force, you wouldn't have seen much movement. And because it relied on a spontaneous comprehension, your forces are imbalanced again. It works for you, for now at least, because you have high affinity in a number of forces, so those spontaneous comprehensions have more potential paths to take. But when you reach a state whether your affinities start lagging behind your dimensional tier, it'll be hard to tell what will happen. You may fall behind those who took slower and steadier steps." Lionel nodded. "I understand. But there is one thing you're missing, my ability index." Anastasia fell into her thoughts and nodded once. Indeed, so-called slower and steadier steps look a lot faster for Lionel simply by virtue of how his mind worked and the speeds it functioned at. "Still, keep this in mind," Anastasia said. Lionel nodded. I'll be going now. I was wondering if it was worth it to put in the effort to gain this full inheritance, but I feel that there's no doubt now. I have to have it. Chapter 1841. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1841. Restrictions: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1841 restrictions. Not long later, Lionel sat in the midst of the meditating youths of the Radix, Midas and Florer. He seemed to have entirely forgotten about the world around him. Although he was very much present, those who looked at him felt as though he wasn't there at all. Every few minutes, his aura would shift slightly and the mysterious well of force that surrounded him only became deeper. Lionel stood in the middle of a world of golden trees, flaming skies and dense rivers of bronze. He walked across the bronze rivers, crossing by the golden trees and feeling the heat of flaming skies above his head. This was the now complete world, of which he had only seen a portion of before. Last time he was here, there was no ground and no sky, only the trees of gold. But now, the world was truly complete and every step he took felt like he was being baptized by an odd energy. What was interesting though was that Lionel didn't feel that it was very difficult at all. The bronze river should have made his legs heavy, but other than a small slowdown, he experienced no other hardships. The golden trees continuously flooded his body with vitality, trying to test to see where his limits lay, but he continuously broke through them as though they didn't exist in the first place. The flaming skies above were supposed to burn his skin, to scorch his wool through, to raise him down to nothing more than a pile of ashes, but compared to the three other challenges, this one was by far the easiest. He had 2 Scarlet Star Force innate nodes within his body. How could normal flames hope to burn him? As he walked forward, the bronze rivers rushed with more vigor, the golden trees shone with more vitality, and the normal flames in the skies became something even more sinister than that, but Lionel only continued to walk forward without the slightest pause. In the outside world, Lionel's once gentle breath became like hurricane-force winds. He didn't seem to be trying very hard, and yet all of the air in the surrounding hundreds of meters surged toward him uncontrollably. Without a choice, the elders could only evacuate the children in the vicinity. They had yet to see such an exaggerated result from meditating on the inheritance, but they had seen somewhat similar results before. Somewhere deep inside, they had hoped that Lionel's results wouldn't be as successful as theirs, in one part due to selfishness, and another part due to them wanting to maintain their usefulness to him. But after seeing this, they knew for a fact that Lionel was simply on a different level. Even the 2 most talented among them, Gray and Magaron, took weeks to reach this level, but Lionel had only been here for a few minutes. Golden flames suddenly took life and danced across Lionel's skin before being absorbed by him and vanishing. Lionel's hair began to grow out to exaggerated length. Soon it had pooled so much that his body could hardly be seen. It was quite a beautiful sight, just endless strands of filaments exuding a gentle pale purple light. It looked like the hair of a deity. At the same time, Lionel's bronze aura appeared once again, becoming thicker and thicker until it bordered an almost dark mustard to dark gold color. It solidified to the point it looked almost as though Lionel had gotten a harsh spray tan that didn't complement him well at all. But then it infused into his skin and seemed to vanish entirely. Just when it vanished, Lionel took another step within the trial world and it appeared again in the outside world, this time rippling outward with wild abandon. This time, however, the bronze aura had gained a tinge of a violet light to it, making it look particularly royal and majestic. This violet hue only continued to grow. Right then, in the depths of Lionel's blood, the faint outline of a 6th set of doors began to form. Across the universe, in the depths of the Morales family hold land, 3 mountain-sized incense sticks continued to burn with a gentle light as the elders meditate in silence, the commotion of the world seemingly having nothing at all to do with them. Until, all at once, their eyes opened with a sudden forcefulness. Boom! The outline of a 9-layered door appeared in the skies of the Holy Land and the Morales family elders watched with trembling hearts. They had never seen such a phenomenon before, but inwardly they all knew what it was. The 6th door. The 5th door of the Morales family had always been a tightly held secret. No one but their most talented knew that their lineage factor had the potential to enter the 8th dimension. However, none of them had known that a sixth door was possible. They had no idea where this door was coming from, and the aura was far too wild and volatile to lock down its location. But all of them still thought of just a single man. They couldn't fathom it being anyone other than Velasco, that man who broke all laws of common sense on his whim. Could it be that he had finally found a path to enter that legendary realm? Could it be that he had finally broken the shackles of the eighth dimension that had bound this universe? Had he finally beaten the regular at its own game? The elders all looked up with shimmering gazes, their hearts practically pounding out of their chest. At this point, even the restrictions of this holy land couldn't block out this aura, and it began to leak, enveloping the human domain and even crossing the barrier into other domains. Lionel continued to sit in silence. In the depths of his bloodline, the fourth door and all of its 9 tiers were nearly blown off its hinges. A door he should have only been able to open when he entered the 7th dimension with his metal body couldn't withstand his blazing aura for even a few short moments, its shackles shattering to pieces. Chapter 1842. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 1842. Bow heads if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1842. Bow heads. Lionel's aura continued to blaze, the 5th door nearly flying from its hinges a moment later. Only then did Lionel's momentum begin so slow before coming to a gentle stop, standing beneath the looming presence of the 6th door. The metal synergy lineage factor was the only one Lionel knew of that had steps to its progress like this. As a result, it couldn't display its full player until it reached a certain point. Lionel could still remember hard being able to manipulate Earth force to change his surroundings when he entered the Void Palace, and that was because back then, he had only opened up the 2nd door. How could he manipulate a 7th-dimensional world, especially one under the influence of anarchic force, when his metal synergy lineage factor was only opened up to the 5th dimension? Of course, things weren't exactly that simple. Despite its supposed weakness, the metal synergy bloodline, especially thanks to its supplemental skills like metal body and divine armor, matched up well and even dwarfed many lineage factors when facing enemies at the same level. But now, Lionel had blown by the usual convention of the metal synergy lineage factor, awakening it to the 8th dimension in just a single step. In an instant, it had gone from one of his weaker lineage factors, at least in terms of raw power and ignoring its supplemental techniques, to one of his absolute strongest. Lionel exhaled a breath, causing winds of such force to manifest that the walls and the surroundings cracked and threatened to collapse the entire building. Lionel opened his eyes slowly, a dense light shooting out of them. When he saw the state of his surroundings, his gaze narrowed for a moment before he waved a hand. At that moment, a wave of earth force took shape and the cracks and damages to the foundation were healed in the blink of an eye. Lionel took another breath and realized he was breathing far too hard and adjusted himself accordingly. Others might take days, weeks, or even months to properly adjust themselves to new strength, but Lionel took only a handful of seconds before it was all reined in. With a hand, Lionel grabbed at his hair and cut it short once more before storing it and standing to his feet. Lionel looked toward the inheritance and his gaze narrowed. Whether it was the chalice, the flame, or the wood ball, all of them had greatly dimmed. It seemed there was a limit to the number of times these treasures could pass on the full inheritance. Lionel wasn't sure if they would recover with time, or if this was permanent, but there was already nothing much he could do to change things. Lionel ruffled his hair and turned to leave. He had a feeling that something big would happen quite soon. Unfortunately this time, it was probably his fault. This change would catalyze a lot of things to happen on a faster timeline than he thought might otherwise happen. This was fine, though. Now he felt even more confident about certain things. Even on a slower timeline, there was no guarantee he would be able to reach this level of strength. %% as Lionel thought, the sudden burst of an aura that transcended anything they had ever felt before coming directly from the Morales family had made many feel as though they were standing on tenterhooks. It only made things worse that Lionel's appearance had completely stabilized the situation in Earth's territory, ruining any chance outside influences had to take advantage of the situation. The momentum of the Morales family felt too fierce. Not only did the races outside the human domain want to stifle it, but so too did even humans themselves. As wise Star Order had said, humans were simply too divided. In such a volatile world, any other race facing this sort of existential crises would have long since come together. In fact, this wasn't just speculation. Not long ago, something very similar had happened to the dwarven race after their first eighth-dimensional world appeared. They had pulled themselves together and fought tooth and nail before succeeding in defending their territory. And what were humans doing? They had yet to pick out a leader. Earth was on the verge of entering the eighth dimension any time now, and it was already obvious that other races were making their moves, but they were more worried about the Morales family gaining too much power too suddenly. Within the Atatsi family, Orinik sat in a courtyard sipping some tea. To his side there was Richard and an unknown young man, or at the very least, he was unknown to most of the world as he had only just come onto the scene. He was none other than the current head of the Aemon family, Montero. They all looked up into the skies when they sensed the aura, their expression frighteningly serious. They fell into silence for a long while, no one speaking for as much as half an hour until an attendant ran in and respectfully handed Orinik a summary report. When Orinik finished reading, he passed it to the other two and smiled lightly. It seems that this time came sooner than I thought it would. We just need to make a subtle little push. What do you intend to do? Montero asked. It's simple, really. The Morales family needs to be knocked down a peg. Lionel Morales needs to be knocked down a peg. Earth needs to be knocked down a peg. There's just one obvious choice, the heirs' wars. Richard and Montero frowned. Seeing their reactions, Orinik chuckled. You two look at the heirs' wars too simply. This isn't just a stage for the Morales family to pick a successor. Why do you think the Constellation families do not participate? It's because they too know that it means more than just a few juniors fighting it out. If the Constellation families participated, it wouldn't just be a friendly clash to pick out the heir with the best future potential, it would instead be a domain war of the human domain. The hearts of the two men skipped a beat. So you want to? Well, we don't really need to do much at all, we just need to plant some seeds. Despite the talent of the other heirs, the one everyone fears the most is Lionel. If the Morales family ends up in his hands, it won't be long before the human domain is ruled by them, and there are too many who don't want to see that day come. You want to force the Morales family to hold the heir wars ahead of time. Orinik's lip curled. Just the act of holding it before they want to will be a slap to their face. It will slow their momentum and humiliate them on a world stage. In addition, because Lionel has yet to enter the seventh dimension, and lost 20 years of preparation, his loss is almost guaranteed. Once he loses the right to lead the Morales family. Well, I will keep some things to myself for now. Will the Morales family bow to such pressure, though? Richard asked. You're still too naive, Orinik laughed. There is no absolute power in the human domain, even in regards to the Morales family. Will they bow their hands? Haven't they done so already once before? Why do you think Velasco isn't the patriarch of the Morales family right now? You can't really believe he just didn't want such power, right? The eyes of the two young men opened wide. The two couldn't help but look toward one another, seeing the clear shock in one another's eyes. %% in a distant place across the universe, Velasco looked up from teasing his wife, his gaze narrowing. In the end, in a rare moment of solemnity, he sighed. However, his sigh had nothing to do with the pressure the Morales family would soon face. That demoness sunk her claws into my son. His gaze became frighteningly cold. He didn't sound like a man that was ignorant of the Silver Empire's inheritance at all. But oddly enough, he didn't seem to be worried about Lionel using it either, and yet he was enraged, no, more accurately annoyed. As for why, maybe only he and a select few knew. Chapter 1843. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 1843. Pretentious. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1843. Pretentious. The Morales family was incredibly complex in structure. One didn't need to be a genius to understand this, just knowing that they had over 1 billion youths born into the Nova generation was enough to necessitate this. Also, these were just the number of youths that had awakened at least one of their lineage factors and couldn't represent the total number of youths born into this generation as a whole. If there were so many born into just a single generation, then it was all too clear just what kind of scale the Morales family was on. Things only became more complex in recent times due to the 20-year time dilation. Because of the circumstances, the next generation of youths, the post-Nova generation, had already been born. Usually, these youths would be gearing up for their own air wars in just another decade or so, but they had ended up unlucky in this regard. With the Nova generation having yet to claim its patriarch, the post-Nova generation might never get a chance to. It also didn't help that while the number of heirs to the Nova generation was much larger than previous years at 7, the post-Nova generation actually had even more, with 9 awakening 2 lineage factors. To the Morales family, this was actually a good problem to have. With so many talents, the elders spent their days smiling so wide that their wrinkles seemed to have entirely smoothed out. But to the rest of the world, this was just another item on the checklist of reasons the Morales family had to be suppressed. Their momentum was too great and it only seemed to be growing more and more every day. Orinik was a lot of things, but a fool wasn't one of them. At the very least, he was correct that there was only so much idling the remainder of the human domain would continue to do, and Lionel would seem to be the catalyst for many of these things. The current patriarch of the Morales family was a man who went by Alejandro Morales. He was the father of First Nova, Daoist, and a man known for his calm temperament and even-keeled approach to things, a far cry from the usual madman the Morales family placed in power. It could be said that it was thanks to Alejandro that the Morales family hadn't been dissected by their enemies. His calm approach to diplomacy had eased a lot of the tension and bad blood that had been caused by the previous air war. There was no doubt that he was a well-respected man who didn't easily display his emotions on his face, but on this day he had a dark cloud hanging over his head, both figuratively and literally. Those who thought of Alejandro as a calm, and even-keeled man had never met him in his youth. He had been forced to train himself to control his temper because whenever he lost it, a black cloud would appear above him just like this one. If those in his vicinity were lucky, he would be able to keep it to this relatively small and miniature size. If they were unlucky, or rather were stupid enough to keep provoking him, this dark cloud would spin entirely out of control and destroy everything in its path. Alejandro had a very rare weather control ability index and he had elevated it to tier 4, which allowed him to create his own atmosphere. This meant he no longer needed to rely on the atmosphere of a planet or a moon to display his ability index. At this level, if he lost control of his temper, an entire solar system could be embroiled in a storm, let alone a single planet. Clearly, he had been so low-key over these last few decades that everyone had forgotten. What other explanation could there be for them to provoke him like this again and again? The Morales family had a lot of turnover at the patriarch position, usually changing every 20 to 30 years at most. This was because their personalities were very suited to leadership to begin with. They were all much too hot-blooded. Alejandro had managed to rein in his temper because he thought he would only have to endure 2 decades of this bullshit. Come to find out that his position would be extended by another 2 decades on top of that. He was already reaching the end of his fuse, and then this nonsense kept coming on his desk again and again. Fuck. Boom. The cloud above his head released a resounding clap of thunder that sent a powerful sound wave in all directions. The window shattered, the walls cracked, the very foundation of the building quaked. Daoist, who was sitting across from his father, slowly lowered his palms from his ears. Clearly, he had been prepared ahead of time, although the result was still jarring. I don't want to read this shit anymore, read it to me. Alejandro threw over a large pile of leaders and leaned back in his chair with an annoyed expression, bringing out a cigar. Daoist shook his head, but eventually still opened up the next one and cleared his throat. Greetings from the Leo family. We are concerned that with the coming race war, the Morales family will be leaderless while moving into this new era. The position of patriarch of the Morales family is one that changes the direction of the whole of the human race. It is best if this is no longer delayed, as it would only be a detriment to the human domain. In proving that we of the Leo family are properly invested in this matter, we are willing to send juniors to participate as well. We are committed to boom. Alejandro's desk shattered. His fuse was really short these days. He had no patience for any of it. Tell them to go fuck themselves. They must really think him a pushover. Fuck, let me see that letter. I want to see the handwriting. If I don't kick the ass of the bastard who wrote the pretentious pile of shit, I'm going to explode. Daoist could only speechlessly hand the letter over to his father. Chapter 1844. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 21 seconds AM. Chapter 1844. Excellent. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1844. Excellent. I knew it was that bastard Van Uzi. He's the only one of those pricks who thinks himself to be a scholar despite having the IQ of a pile of shit from a donkey's ass. Daoist's lip twitched. The world hadn't seen his father's foul mouth in too long, so they had clearly forgotten. But he and his mother were all too well aware, they could only allow the man to rant. So, Daoist did so until Alejandro seemed to have finally run out of breath. We're going to have to do it anyway, Dad. Alejandro looked toward his son with bloodshot eyes as though he could swallow him whole. For a second, he saw a reflection of himself 40 years ago, back when he still had the patience to remain calm. The apple didn't fall too far from the tree, so Alejandro knew all too well that his son had a temper no less fiery than his own. It was just that the two had bothered to learn how to control it, unlike many of the others. Even so, he felt like he wanted to take a bite out of his son's head right now, even though he knew that he was correct. There were certain things that had to be done in the name of keeping the peace. If a family only knew how to move forward and never took a step back, things could easily reach a point of no return. However, the goal of these people was too infuriating. Holding the Air Wars was for no other purpose than to suppress Lionel. Even 6th Nova, Valor, had now stepped into the 7th dimension after so long at the peak of the 6th. The youths of the Cataclysm generation were also taking that step one after another. The only one at a decidedly cruel disadvantage was Lionel. This was infuriating on multiple fronts. For one, the Morales family had no desire to suppress one of their own. And secondly, these actions were like the world saying that his own son was inferior. Even if he was inferior to Velasco, did his son not get a chance to at least prove himself before the world decided that he couldn't match up to the former son? This enraged Alejandro just as much as anything else. But even a step beyond this, it was clear that the greatest goal here, especially with the Constellation families insisting on taking part, was to kill Lionel. Even in the case that they didn't kill him, it was to at least knock him down a peg, to crush his confidence, maybe even to do him harm that he couldn't heal from, to cripple him. This was the underlying motivation of all of this, and they were asking Alejandro to sanction it. To them, if so many families were participating at once, it would be impossible for Velasco to target all of them, not to mention the fact that it would only be the juniors participating to begin with. Lionel's life wasn't what was truly important here, it was his connection with Earth. If a Prince of Earth became the patriarch of the Morales family, what that meant and represented was on a completely different level than the current status quo. The Morales family would have every right to move in and monopolize the whole of Earth. This was something the other families could not allow, and as such, Lionel couldn't be allowed to continue pressing forward and growing at his own leisurely pace. With everything laid out like this, there was little the others could do. If the Morales family was firm in rejecting this, then the one to suffer the most would be Lionel. Those families had taken this approach for the sake of maintaining a faint veil of cordiality. If the Morales rejected, then it was just another step towards shedding all pretenses and they would have to be ready to war with the whole of the human domain. That doesn't mean we have to roll over either, Daoist said with a smile. Alejandro, who was already annoyed, just rolled his eyes. Just get to the point, you're so long-winded. I swear you get it from your mo. Alejandro immediately stopped and cleared his throat. His eyes darted around and he only breathed a sigh of relief after he realized his wife wasn't here. He had almost forgotten himself as he lost his temper, that could have ended very badly. Daoist raised an eyebrow but just chuckled in the end. Since they want to participate, let them participate. But not as supporters, but as heirs themselves. Since they like to think themselves capable of suppressing our family, I'd like to see what they can do when they're forced to be on a stage with us. Alejandro slammed his palms on the table. Excellent. Firstly, this could be packaged as an event separate from the Heirs Wars, although it would functionally still be the Air Wars. Due to this, the hit the Morales family took to their reputation would be minimized. Secondly, it would give the Morales family heirs a chance to completely suppress the heirs of the other families and crush them one by one, thus mitigating the blow to their reputation even further. In fact, there was even an opportunity to gain reputation. And thirdly, maybe the best part of all, due to the fact these participating heirs would have to gather up their own cohorts and supporters now, it would delay the matter for some time. It would take them a while before they were confident enough to match up their own cohorts with that of the Morales family heirs. Of course, this might leave room for the heirs to be backstabbed, so there was some risk involved. If the Morales heirs' people weren't trustworthy enough and had ties to other powerful families, it would be easier to suddenly find yourself without any support in the end at all. This was a double-edged sword that had to be baked into this event, or else the other families would never agree. If the Morales heirs had all the advantages, wouldn't the rest only be appearing to be humiliated? It seemed that during his reign, the world had forgotten to fear the Morales. In that case, Alejandro would let the juniors remind them first before the old fogies like himself stepped in. Chapter 1845. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 22 a.m. Chapter 1845, Arrogant. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The reply of the Morales was surprisingly calm, but the reaction to it was anything but. There was only one word the human domain had to describe it. Arrogant. The release Alejandro made was quite simple. He accepted the terms of the other families. He said that he would happily welcome the families of the human domain to participate in their heir wars. In fact, he was a bit surprised that none had ever requested to in the past. He felt that the youths of the human domain could have learned a lot from their previous generations, and he was happy that they would finally start with the Nova generation. These words alone were a clear gauntlet thrown. He might as well have stepped out and slapped each one of their faces individually, and yet he had done it with a genial smile on his face and without the slightest hint of anger in his tone. However, this was only the very beginning. Alejandro's statement continued. In commemoration of this change, the Morales family had decided to change things up. They would open up the heir wars zone to all of the heirs of the human domain. Anyone, regardless of background, could sign up to be an heir. The only requirement was that one had to display strength equivalent to a sector-ranked disciple of the Void Palace and had to have at least 3 seventh-dimensional existences willing to subordinate themselves to you. The only other catch was that these seventh-dimensional existences could not be older than 100 years old. Just these rules alone cut off the path of many people. It had to be remembered that Richard was already in his 70s when Lionel first met him, and yet he had only been at Tier 9 of the 5th dimension. In addition, he had been in what could be considered a family at the very pinnacle of the 6th dimension. So, these rules cut off the opportunity to a lot of people. But from the very beginning, the Morales were only interested in teaching the families capable of pressuring them a lesson. This wasn't a free-for-all. The Heir Wars Zone wasn't just a place of battle, it was also one of the Morales family's greatest resources. This couldn't be casually opened up to outsiders just because. In his concluding statements, Alejandro said that this would be the first domain-wide heir wars in their history, so he hoped that the other families would show their sincerity. As rewards, the Morales family would be putting up not only their various body-tempering pools on the line, but they also placed a chance to meditate within their holy land as one of their top prizes. This news alone unleashed a reign of chaos. Everyone knew that the Morales family body-tempering pools were the best in the whole of the human domain, and maybe even in the whole of the universe. They were divided into several grades. There were their common pools, their elite pools, their divine pools, and finally their transcendent pools. To put into perspective just how valuable these pools were, just take the common pools for example. By soaking in the common pool just once a week, one could reach the 7th dimension in the conventional path in just 10 years while doing no other training. And that was just the common pool. The elite pool could have this same effect in just 1 year. The divine pool could have this same effect in just 1 month. The transcendent pool could allow this result in just a single dip. The shocking value of such a thing didn't need to be explained. While the Morales family only had just 3 transcendent pools, their number of common pools could be counted in the tens of thousands. There was a reason they held nigh untouchable prowess within the human domain. Even so, the body-tempering pools paled in comparison to the Holy Land, or more accurately, the breath of incense one could inhale within the Holy Land. Breathing in these fumes would help one enter a state of enlightenment. Although there would be diminishing returns every time one inhaled these fumes, it was said that during the first time, depending on how deep your immersion, you might be able to break through several tiers at once along the God path. This was akin to the difference between heaven and earth. Lionel breaking through 2 stages at once was enough to leave the Umbra family, who had the 3-finger cult as a reference, in complete and utter shock. However, the breath of incense within the Morales family's Holy Land could induce similar results. Usually, the geniuses of the Morales family would delay their first inhalation for the longest period of time possible. The further they could make it first, the more valuable the first inhalation. There were even records of those with the best results crossing 3 and very rarely 4 tiers at once within the 7th dimension. A single tier divide within the 7th dimension, especially along the God path, was even larger than the gap between Tier 1 and Tier 9 of the 6th dimension. And yet, this single inhalation could allow such a chance. The Morales family was very clearly forcing the hands of the other powerful families. They wanted to play games and poke the bear, right? Well, in that case, if they wanted to even have the face to participate in these heirs' wars, they had better bring out the best treasures they had, or else they would be laughed out of the room before they even had a chance to catch their breath. Alejandro had laid down a very heavy gauntlet. In 3 months' time, they would hold a conference on planet Morales to iron out the rules of the domain heir wars. In addition, by then, these families were to have their list of participants and the treasures they would be putting up prepared. The Morales family had made their move and the chessboard seemed to have been flipped. Chapter 1846. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 18 seconds AM. Chapter 1846. Scorned if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel, who had just been making his way back to the flagship, paused and looked up. There didn't seem to be anything in the night sky, but he kept looking. Just half a minute later, a blinding flash of bronze light came and Lionel suddenly raised his hand and snagged it out of the air. Oh! Lionel had never received such a thing before, but he was almost entirely certain that it had come from the Morales family. He could just feel that familiar sort of familial aura. He quickly read it once, then twice, something he never had to do considering his memory. But the first time he read it, it was for information. The second time, however, Lionel burst into a fit of laughter, his laughter so loud that it echoed across planet Radix. He hadn't had a good laugh like this one in a while. The Morales family was indeed to his liking. Even if he hadn't grown up with them, he still felt like he was one of them. A conference in 3 months, huh? Interesting. He could feel that the Morales family was buying him time. They could have put the conference in a week from now and it would have still been enough time for those large families to react, but they hadn't done so. By the time the conference was finished, probably another month would have passed. Considering the complexity of organizing such an event, Lionel wouldn't be surprised if it took even longer than that. Then there'd probably be at least a couple months after that for final preparations. This meant even the earliest time for the domain heir wars to begin would be about 6 months from now. It wouldn't even be a surprise if it took up to an additional year, in fact. The Morales family had indeed done its best to give him all the time they could, something they definitely didn't have to do. From Lionel's understanding, compared to the most powerful branches of the Morales family, that of him, his father and his uncle could be considered to be the smallest. It should just be the 3 of them and their wives, making up barely 6 people. They had probably been larger in the past, but after his grandfather's death, or maybe even in direct result of his grandfather's death, that ship had sailed long ago. This was to say that the influence they had on the family outside of their personal prowess was limited and definitely couldn't be compared to the other 6 heirs, especially now Daoist and Alejandro, who currently headed the ruler faction of the family. In addition, those other families might think that Lionel was in cahoots with the Morales family to monopolize Earth, but only Lionel and the upper echelons of the Morales knew for certain that this was definitely not the case. To others, it was only natural that they protect Lionel because they wanted those resources, but Lionel knew that they were actually doing this for nothing in return. And yet, they still stepped out to protect him. In his actions, Lionel never really thought much about the Morales family. He was so used to the world being against him that he had just assumed the Morales would be +1 to that category. Even when it came to Earth, he was hyper-aware that if he ever wanted it to truly be his, he would have to unseat his grandfather. However, today, he realized that the Morales family weren't so calculating with him. They didn't ask him for anything, they simply protected him because his last name was Morales. They didn't need anything more. Lionel felt a hint of guilt in his heart when he thought to this point. Slowly, Lionel closed the letter and carefully put it away. Lionel titled his head up to the skies again and closed his eyes, falling into silence. He wouldn't allow the Morales to be humiliated on his behalf. Since these families wanted to pressure them, he would just have to make them pay a price they weren't willing to. They all knew that the human domain needed to unite against their common enemy, and yet instead of doing so, they were more worried about who would come out on top in the end. Even though Lionel wanted to take the Ascension Empire from his grandfather, did he ever do anything to harm Earth? Even though he wanted the Morales to be under his rule, did he ever harm his cousins? His actions were always measured, and when need be, he stepped out to help even if it was in detriment to himself. However, it was clear to him that the human domain and their powerful families wouldn't be sensible. In that case, there was only one path forward: absolute power. He would crush them one by one until they could no longer raise their heads, and he would start with their little prides and joys. Lionel opened his eyes and his gaze became entirely restrained. At that moment, he looked no different from a commoner youth without the slightest hint of energy leaking from him. With a step forward, he vanished. In the depths of the human domain, there was a particular alliance that was stirred by this, and that was the very one headed by the Omen family. The family who stood maybe in most opposition to the Morales outside of the Suyar family. The Omens, the heads of the Force Crafting Guild Alliance. The scorned Queen Beauty had been completely silent in recent decades, not making any splashes more movements. She simply silently went about her business, and the Force Crafting Guild continued to flourish under her rulership, growing silently more powerful every day. Even months ago, when she received news that her record in the Void Palace had been broken, she hadn't made any movements whatsoever. However, when news of the Morales family's domain conference reached her ears, she casually told one of her attendants to prepare transportation for her on that day. For the first time in decades, Cynthia Omen, the scorned Queen Beauty, was going to make a public appearance. Chapter 1847. Published at 11th of May 2023, 2:39 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1847. Thank you. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel appeared on the flagship again and looked in a certain direction before a smile bloomed on his face. Not bad, he thought to himself. He had been paying attention when Raylion first took the demon pill. As he had expected, the process was anything but pretty. For all intents and purposes, he had practically died. However, Raylion was very special for one reason, and that was that his ability index was telekinesis. Lionel hadn't thought about it much before, but after piecing together that Yuri was most definitely a spiritual, he realized that the ability index she displayed was most likely not her real ability index. Of course, it had to be remembered that Yuri's ability index was also telekinesis, or so it seemed. Lionel had posited that there were certain ability index that humans had that were actually just close replications of the greatest strength of other races. There was also a specific category of soul-type ability indexes that gave humans abilities ranging closer to what one might expect a spiritual to have. For example, Wise Star Orders and Era's Immortality Ability Index was actually just an ability that spirituals are naturally born with. Likewise, telekinesis fell into this category as well. Lionel didn't believe that he was unique. If he could find a method to separate his soul from his body under semi-natural conditions, he believed that other humans could do it as well. They just had to have a certain impetus and a baseline level of talent for it. And, in the case that they succeed, the benefits to their related soul talents would benefit greatly as well. In truth, Lionel's real hypothesis was even crazier than that. He thought there might be a chance that spirituals were just evolved humans who shed the need for their mortal bodies. But he didn't have any real evidence for such thoughts other than some ability indexes and the fact he could separate his own soul, so he had only assigned about a 3 to 4% probability of such a thing being real. But now that Raylion had confirmed his hypothesis, that 3 to 4% had increased to about 11 to 12%. Raylion looked down at his own hands, an unbelievable power coursing through his veins. As a person with telekinetic abilities, his body had never been very powerful. He could just make it look like it was by using his telekinesis. But right now, he felt like he had been entirely reborn, as though he had risen from the ashes like a phoenix. Months ago, when he first swallowed the pill, he thought he was finished. His body couldn't withstand the impact and he had directly exploded apart. However, thankfully, a mysterious energy had protected his ethereal glabella from shattering along with the rest of his body. From that point on, whether he succeeded or not was entirely reliant on himself. He was unwilling to give up, unwilling to let his dream go, unwilling to leave Sail behind. She seemed so strong, but she could also be so frail sometimes. She had just finally climbed out from that rut of guilt she had spent years in. He didn't want her to go back into it because of him. So he had held it together, he had scratched and clawed. A mysterious energy had perfectly sealed the room around him, so whether it was his ethereal glabella, his soul, or the energy of the pill that had shattered his body, it was all trapped in an enclosed space. Raylion hadn't had much time to think about it at the time, but he realized after he was out of the danger zone that this had been a great help to him. If someone else heard the commotion and barged in, he would likely be finished and never get the chance. At the same time, because the energy was restricted to a relatively small region, he was able to slowly gain the ability to use his telekinesis to reel it in and force it into his control to begin reforming his body. This was the very first time that Raylion had ever used his telekinesis on an intangible object like energy. He hadn't even known that such a thing was possible until now. Just that process alone had evolved his ability index to a level it had never before touched. If he could control any and all energies with his telekinesis, didn't that mean that he had affinity for any force he so pleased? He had never had affinities before, so he had been limited in this regard, but didn't he have such a chance now? Raylion gripped his fists and his body crackled. At the same time, there were small warps and swirls in space that were invisible to the naked eye, but he could feel oh so clearly through his telekinesis. He felt that if he wanted to, he could even rip a hole through the void with his telekinesis. Raylion was even further shocked by this realization. His body had fallen to the third dimension after being reconstructed, but somehow he still held so much power. If he returned to the fifth dimension like he had been before, just what kind of power would he hold then? And what if he stepped beyond that? This was it, this was the power he had been hoping for all this time. No. This was the talent he had been hoping for all this time. This power was just the beginning. Raylion looked up toward the ceiling, his gaze glistening with unshed tears that he refused to allow to fall. He gripped his fists harder and harder until the droplets that fell were crimson as opposed to a salty teardrop of emotion. He exhaled a slow breath and stood to his feet. He had to increase his dimensional level as quickly as possible to allow his body to catch up to his soul. Raylion reached for the door handle but paused for a moment. He raised his head to the ceiling and unleashed a mighty roar that shook the room and threatened to destroy it, and yet had no effect on the outside. Only after this and putting on a set of robes did he return to his normal placid self, opening the door and stepping out into what felt like a new world. Thank you, Lionel. Chapter 1848. Published at 11th of May 2023 2:39 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1848. Same level. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel faintly nodded to himself. Right now, Raylion's telekinesis was on an entirely different level, whether that be in terms of strength or sensitivity, purely because it no longer had to deal with the barrier of his own body. Right now, his soul talent could truly flourish because it wasn't being forcefully restricted by the limitation of his body. This was a barrier that all those with soul talent faced. Because the soul was fused with the body, one would inevitably hold back the other. Just by separating them, Raylion underwent a qualitative change. But by also increasing the strength of Raylion's body on top of that, his future potential had been completely rewritten and evolved. The current Raylion, especially due to the fact he had reconstructed his body as a citizen of Earth, had gained an extraordinary amount of benefits that would only continue into the future. As things stood now, Lionel believed that he was only a step or two below the Cataclysm generation in terms of strength, and if he practiced again and entered the sixth dimension, there should be minimal differences between them. If Raylion took a step beyond and continued to seek out power and entered a unique god path of his own, then the benefits could only be said to be extraordinary. He may surpass the members of the Cataclysm generation and never look back. Raylion wasn't the only one who had benefited greatly. In fact, it was unknown if he was the one who had even benefited the most. In Hephaestus' room, his body was undergoing a great number of changes as well, but unlike the others, due to his ability index, Hephaestus' ability to assimilate and benefit from the demon pills was on another level entirely. While everyone else needed to restructure their body or improve their foundation, Hephaestus was just restructuring himself. He was becoming a demon. This was a fundamentally different thing. If others only gained 50% of what they could from a demon pill, he gained all 100%. He not only gained their strong bodies, he gained their affinities, their strengths, their abilities, their reflexes, their healing factors, everything. The best part was that Lionel had purposely picked out demon types that were well suited to him and his battle style. He consumed several blade-type demons, allowing him to literally grow swords and claws as extensions of his body as he pleased, and he topped it all off by consuming a large number of fire demons. That session alone allowed him to enter the seventh dimension with the conventional path, a shocking feat that he never thought would be possible for him, but what was even more shocking was that this was the end of what Lionel had in store for him. After essentially becoming a perfect fusion of blade and fire demon, Lionel sent Hephaestus to the Radix family where he was allowed to meditate on the flame within the chalice. When Hephaestus left, he did so with only a third of the inheritance, but with his body having undergone yet another qualitative change. Not only did he have the body of a blade fire demon, but he could now swallow flames to strengthen his body and vitality. Due to his foundation as a blade fire demon, his skill in this third of the inheritance was even beyond that Midas family of the past by an extraordinarily large measure. He felt so invincible that he roared up into the skies, laughing beside himself. Sale had also benefited greatly from a third of the inheritance, namely the Flora family's third, the wooden sphere. It had to be remembered that Sale had a unique ability index. She underwent a mutation of sorts when she entered a battle state, gaining a floral battle armor more dangerous than even many metal-forged armor. If Lionel had to describe it, Sale's ability index was similar to his divine armor, but executed with plants and vitality as opposed to metal and vitality. Just with this alone, she was exceptionally powerful. She had become the most powerful combatant of the etching metal organization, and that was even with Emna being present. After fusing with a third of the inheritance, her strength increased by leaps and bounds and she felt that her capacity to create more and more powerful armors with her ability index had increased. In fact, her tears began to plummet as well and she nearly fell out of the sixth dimension entirely, but the trade-off was far greater strength than she had ever personally experienced. Much like Hephaestus, she double-dipped with benefits. After she had improved her ability index, Lionel sent her to Earth to gather up any evolved plants she might be able to increase her own strength with. By the time the months came and time ticked by, she actually returned as an expert of the seventh dimension, her aura causing the cocky Hephaestus to look on with the first serious expression he had made in recent days as he had been too busy grinning ear to ear previously. Even with all of this being the case, though, the one who benefited the most was, without a doubt, Emna. All on her own, Emna had been very close to forging her own path, and that was without any sort of external resources to aid her. She simply relied on nothing other than her own talent. For her, Lionel did a few things. First, he sent her to Old Man Hutch. Although Lionel hadn't believed in the old man's path of the blade, he believed that it would be useful for others. Plus, this was the first time Emna was facing a master with talents comparable to her own in the blade and she gained a lot. After she returned, Lionel handed her a perfection stone. Then, she disappeared for months. No one knew where she went and she seemed to have vanished off of the earth entirely. But when she returned, no one could withstand the pressure of looking her in the eye. It felt as though one was staring at the sun, and if they did so for too long, their pupils would be shredded to pieces. Emna had perfected her path and finally stepped into the sixth dimension. Of them all, she was the only one with power comparable to Lionel and Aina at the same level. Chapter 1849. Published at 11th of May 2023 2:39 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 1849. Prepared if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel, obviously, wouldn't neglect his brothers. But the changes that he could make to a talent of Earth already within the 7th dimension were minimal. However, what he could do was greatly improve their foundations and affinities by allowing them to swallow demon pills. His brothers had their own thoughts on things and Lionel didn't underestimate the progress they had made on their own. He no longer tried to guide them, he simply gave them resources and they used them as they deemed fit. Lionel had quite a lot of trust in them and he believed that they would give him a pleasant surprise when the time came. He gave them all focus crystals which could help increase their affinities. Then he scheduled time for everyone to use the perfection stone. Now that there was only a small amount of time remaining, Lionel reminded them to train hard, but to also think of rest. When there was only a month remaining until the Air Wars, he wanted everyone to focus on relaxing first, and worry about everything else later. With everything on the right track, Lionel prepared to enter seclusion himself to wait for the tribulation to begin. But before he could, his cousin came to visit him. Lionel smiled. "Noah, I'm glad you're doing all right." Noah smiled a bit bitterly, but he still shook his head. "I should be thanking you and saying that. It's good that you made it out of the zone, I wouldn't know what to do with this guilt if you hadn't." Lionel laughed. "It's not that big of a deal, that zone wouldn't be able to hold me for long anyway. So what brings you here?" Noah's expression turned serious. "I wanted to tell you personally that I won't be able to help you with the Air Wars. I've committed to staying on Earth and dealing with anything that might come. Imperial Grandfather can't always take action personally for reasons that I'm not sure of, but I trust him enough that I know he has good reasons. I'm not as good as you, but I still have an obligation to Earth and its people first." "Oh, is that all? Why do you sound so solemn?" "I understand," Lionel chuckled. Despite Lionel's demeanor, Noah sighed in a hint of relief on one end, but a hint of bitterness on another. Somewhere deep inside he wanted Lionel to want his help, but Lionel's confidence in moving forward without him left him feeling complicated. Noah shook his head. His thoughts right now were childish, they were both grown men now, and although their relationship had started off a bit rocky, it could be considered to be in a good place now. Noah hadn't had many true friends growing up, but Lionel could truly be considered one now. Noah nodded heavily. "Then I'll stay here and protect our empire on this front, and you can go out there and show them who's boss." Finally, Noah smiled, a rare thing from him, but a genuine thing nonetheless. He felt like a weight had been taken off of his shoulders. Lionel grinned. "Of course." Lionel saw Noah off and finally got some time to himself. Now that everything was set, he felt a bit odd. He wasn't used to being so prepared. Things usually came flying at him from all directions, and he was forced to deal with them while more things were coming in overhead. It could be said that a Lionel with preparation time was exceptionally dangerous. Too dangerous. Lionel closed his eyes and entered a state of meditation. He calmed his breathing and allowed his mind to rest for the first time in a long while. Lionel didn't know how long had passed, but when he opened his eyes again, he found himself sitting on an elevated platform in the depths of a force. When he tried to stand, the platform vanished and he was gently deposited onto the ground. It started just like that? Not even a hint of warning either. Lionel looked down at his hand and he found a familiar wooden spear in his hand. It was the very first spear he had ever gotten from the spear domain ring and one he thought had long since been destroyed. It was the somewhat crooked and handcrafted wooden spear of the primitive man. Lionel looked down at himself and he found that he was almost naked outside of a beast-skin skirt that allowed a decidedly clear draft up and between his legs. He could feel his manly bits dangling about in the wild. Clearly, whoever crafted this beast-skin skirt had no sense of modesty. Lionel shook his head. Did he get transported into the body of another primitive man? No, that shouldn't be right. He was definitely in his own body, he would be able to tell the difference. It seemed that he was just transported to an odd time. But what was the most peculiar was that all of his strength had vanished. He couldn't access the abilities of his metal body, and his skin's defenses weren't much different from a normal man. Whether it was speed or strength, he was within the realms of a third-dimensional man now. In fact, other than his mind being somewhat sharper, his ability index seemed to be restricted as well. Lionel looked around, wondering when the other foot was going to drop. Where was the danger? The challenge? The enemy he had to face? But even after several seconds of standing around doing nothing, nothing came. So this tribulation isn't a challenge like the Emperor's Might tablet, for example. It's more like a zone. Lionel frowned. The trouble was that he didn't have his silver dictionary, and none of his treasures were with him. And, with his ability index all but gone, he had no way of sensing the rules and restrictions of this zone via normal means. Lionel looked in a certain direction and moved toward it. Since there was nothing to go off of, he couldn't just stand in place and do nothing. Chapter 1850. Published at 11th of May 2023 2:39 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1850. Unexpected. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel found himself feeling quite uncomfortable. Using his eyes and ears like a normal person, not to mention continuously turning his head from left to right, was annoying him. He never had to put so much effort into paying attention to his surroundings. Ever since the metamorphosis had descended, he had been able to escape such a mundane fate. Unfortunately, he had no choice but to do so now. Without an understanding of where the danger may or may not be coming from, and while being in a completely unknown environment, not being at least this cautious would be a death wish. Lionel's steps suddenly came to a grinding halt, and he ducked behind a tree for a moment before scampering up its side as though doing his best to impersonate a squirrel. He swung himself up and landed lightly, his eyes darting above before he suddenly froze in place. Without hesitation, Lionel leapt onto a higher branch, moving as far up as it would allow him before swinging to a tree to its side that happened to be taller and moving up even further. At that moment, what had been subtle rumbling became deep and resonating. As Lionel held his breath, the shaking of the ground became more pronounced, and the tree he was perched within began to sway back and forth more fiercely, threatening to knock him off of his perch. Even so, Lionel held on tightly, his lips sealed tight and his chest not moving in the slightest. At this moment, he didn't even dare to breathe as the creature passed below. When it finally entered his sight, Lionel's pupils constricted. The beast couldn't have been more generic. It was just a saber-toothed tiger. But that wasn't the problem. This saber-toothed tiger was 5 meters long and 3 meters tall. To make matters more astonishing, its every bound was several hundred meters, a distance that would definitely have been further if not for the thick trees around it. But even more astonishing than that was its weight. With the way it moved, so quickly and so agilely, one would have never expected it to land with such force. The entire forest ground seemed to quake beneath its movement. The saber-toothed tiger zipped by Lionel, not noticing him. But its aura continued to linger in the air, coating Lionel's skin with a faint sheen of sweat. Lionel's senses might have been dulled without his ability index, but his instincts were still there, instincts he had been honing ever since he unlocked the primitive man's life and experienced what he had experienced. He knew with just a glance that in his current state, he didn't stand a chance against that saber-toothed tiger. If he had allowed it to sense him, he would probably have lost his life right here and now. Large beasts weren't something that Lionel had ever seen before. No, more accurately, he had never seen them outside of that zone. In the dimensional verse, creatures, no matter how powerful they were, fell within a normal range of size. Little Blackstar was a prime example of this. It wasn't until that zone he had seen a creature with a wingspan of dozens of meters. Regardless of why this was, this place definitely had creatures that were not only extraordinarily powerful, but also exaggerated sizes. Battling them would be incredibly difficult, especially when restrained to this stick they called a spear. At some point, if the creatures reached a size that was too large, even his most powerful of strikes would be nothing more than paper cuts to them. To make matters worse, if they managed to keep the kind of speed that saber-toothed tiger had even as their sizes increased, he might as well pack his bags now and go home. Lionel's gaze sharpened. After making sure that the tiger was gone, he leapt forward, moving from tree to tree. He hoped that it would be somewhat safer up here, but he had no way of knowing that for sure, so he kept a sharp lookout. For all he knew, a bird with a 50-meter wingspan might swoop down at him at any moment. Lionel had no idea where he was going, but he just kept moving forward. He assumed that the first thing he should do was gather information, but he had no idea where to start. In the end, he decided to keep moving until he at least found a water source. If his body was in this state, it likely wouldn't be long before he needed food and water, so he might as well get the hard stuff out of the way immediately. Lionel came across several more behemoth-like creatures. Even the smallest of them would stand to his height of over 2 meters tall even while on all fours. The biggest of them were entire heads or two taller than the saber-toothed tiger. He unceremoniously dodged every single one, his expression becoming more and more solemn. He had yet to come across a creature he had any confidence in defeating, and he also hadn't seen the point of this trial yet, nor had he found a water source. Bang! Lionel suddenly crashed into what felt like an immovable wall. He had been scanning his surroundings with the utmost diligence, not missing a single thing, only for him to suddenly run into an invisible force field. Lionel was so caught off guard that he fell out of the tree he was in, catching the attack of a creature below. Lionel's brows jumped as his nose began to bleed from the collision. But that was the least of his worries as he fell toward a wolf that was over 7 meters long and twice his height. Quickly trying to regain his bearings as he fell through the air, Lionel threw a vicious kick at a nearby tree trunk, just barely managing to get a solid hit on it that sent him flying toward an adjacent tree. He grabbed onto a tree branch and swung himself upward, a cold wind just barely nipping at his ankles. Lionel didn't need to look to know that it was the wolf that had swiped a claw at him just now. His heart leapt into his throat. He felt like someone was messing with him. How could a force field come out of nowhere? And what the hell was it doing in the middle of a forest? No, more importantly, how was he going to survive the bloodthirsty wolf below him? Chapter 1851. Published at 11th of May 2023 2:39 and 5 seconds p.m. Chapter 1851, PCHU. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's jaw steeled. He realized that without his ability index, his ability to remain cold and analytical had dampened quite a measure. It was an odd experience for him as he had had this ability with him for as long as he could remember. Even back on Earth when it was still in the third dimension, he could tap into it. But now, it was entirely suppressed. It was the first time Lionel had experienced such a thing. Even the dimensional cleanse trial zone couldn't suppress his ability index. Whatever the spear domain ring was, or whatever its origins, it was clearly a step beyond, maybe even beyond what the regulator could control. That seemed to be the only explanation. When Lionel realized this, his gaze became icy. He was his ability index, not the other way around. The wolf suddenly stretched out its body, kneeling close to the ground. Lionel's gaze narrowed. It's about to jump. He knew that this was a life or death matter. The agility of this wolf and its strength was definitely far beyond the saber-toothed tiger. He had already noticed in his journey here that in this place, bigger size equaled bigger strength. In that case, if the saber-toothed tiger could jump across hundreds of meters, this wolf could definitely reach him even though he was so high up. Bang! The wolf jumped and Lionel pierced out with his spear at the exact same time. He revolved the only ability he had, his spear domain lineage factor, and thrust down with a pulse of blinding golden light. Shying. Pung. His spear blade vanished and appeared hundreds of meters below, timing its appearance perfectly and just as the wolf was gathering all of its momentum. In that instant, Lionel's strike downward and the wolf's jump upward combined in strength. Lionel felt a surging power travel up his arm, threatening to break it, but he grit his teeth and held strong until his feet were lifted up and off the branch he was on. This time, there was no recovery. He flew up and back with astonishing speed even as the wolf below howled in misery and unbridled rage. Lionel's blade had aimed right for its most sensitive region, its eyes. Clearly, this beast hadn't expected Lionel's blade to suddenly appear out of nowhere, nor had it expected for its own jumping momentum to be used against it. In that instant, it was half blinded and its jumping spiraled out of control, losing half its strength and causing its body to spin off to the side. Lionel crashed against the barrier that had caused all of this to happen and nearly lost control of his spear. His inner organs rattled and his bones almost shattered. Luckily, although his other lineage factors and abilities were suppressed, his body still retained some of its rigidity, albeit weakened to a great extent. So, he avoided the most devastating sorts of damage. Even so, he found himself sliding down a perfectly vertical force field with nothing but air between himself and a more than 300-meter fall. Lionel didn't even look back toward the force field. He knew that his crashing up against it had also knocked him out of range of using it to propel himself to another tree. So, instead, he looked toward the spiraling wolf and pierced out again. His strike was cold and precise. He had realized a few things in this short exchange. The first and most obvious was that his spear domain lineage factor was indeed his greatest reliance, and it could, indeed, pose a threat to these creatures, no matter how minimal. Second, these creatures lacked any sort of real intelligence, at least not any comparable to higher dimensional creatures or humans. At the very least, this was true for the ones he had come across until this point. Third, he wasn't helpless. These were things he probably would have realized instantly if his ability index and split minds hadn't been locked away. But even so, it was a realization he was happy with nonetheless. As the saying went, better late than never. Lionel's strike landed perfectly on the spiraling wolf's other, blinding it completely as it howled in sheer madness and malice-laced fury. Its claws and tail lashed out in all directions, just hoping and praying that it could hit Lionel just one good time. It knew that the human that had done this to it was fragile and weak, just one hit would end his puny life. Unfortunately for it, Lionel had used the rebounding momentum of that strike to land in another tree while it fell heavily into the ground. Even so, the wolf's claws and tail spun around with such fierce momentum that it left blade marks in surrounding trees without even physically touching them. The prowess of this wolf was simply off of the charts. Even with his success, Lionel's expression was solemn. He had put his everything into those two strikes, and had even attacked the wolf's most sensitive and fragile region, and yet he hadn't managed to kill it. Even the flesh of the wolf's eyes were so sturdy that he barely managed to pierce in a few inches. He couldn't even imagine what would have happened if he targeted another part of its body instead. Lionel braced himself. He knew why. He was too far away. If he wanted to take this behemoth down before its tantrum called any more beasts over, he had to get closer. Lionel ripped off a tree branch and threw it in a direction after coating it with spear force. Pung! The instant the wolf turned in that direction, Lionel swooped down from the skies, his movements fast and agile. He landed without the hint of a sound, ducking beneath the swinging tail of the wolf beast and piercing out with his full might. Pchu! The eye of the wolf was punctured again, this time by a half-foot. Lionel jumped back, dodging out of the range of a claw strike, but even so, the residual force shredded the skin of his chest apart. Lionel knew that he had been located by the wolf just now. He had underestimated its senses. But even so, he unleashed a roar, thrusting again with his greatest strength. The golden crown of a spear appearing upon his forehead and his aura caused the wind to still. Chapter 1852. Published at 11th of May 2023 2:39 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1852. Image: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bang. Lionel was rocked. He was sent flying into a tree with such force that he nearly cut it in half. Even so, he felt that satisfying feeling of his spear piercing through truly tender flesh. No matter how powerful the wolf beast, there was no way that even its brain would be so fortified, right? The last mournful howl of the beast echoed as Lionel's head swam. He nearly lost consciousness, but he bit his tongue. He couldn't afford to lose his mind here. Lionel coughed up a mouthful of blood and stumbled once before pushing himself to his feet and nearly falling to the ground again. Damn it. He had a mild concussion and all the wind was knocked out of him. In fact, he was also pretty sure that he had cracked a few ribs as well, not to mention the ugly gashes on his chest now. It was lucky, though, that the latter were just skin deep. But even so, in this environment, and considering his body was back in the third dimension, this kind of injury could kill him if he didn't deal with it properly. Wouldn't it be too pathetic if he lost his life to an infection after having already become a sixth-dimensional existence? Even back in third-dimensional Earth, people almost never died from such things. Technology had gotten much too far. Lionel stood weakly to his knees and thought about running, but he shook his head again in a vain attempt to clear it. He knew that he needed to understand what was going on with that barrier first. Why had it appeared? Why was it there? And why was there not even a single warning? Lionel rushed up to the barrier and pressed a hand against it. He couldn't pass through no matter how hard he pushed, and the barrier showed no signs of giving in. Lionel frowned a moment and shook his head again, his fogginess beginning to clear a bit. There were no obstructions to his sight. He could see to the other side all too easily, which was why he had run into it to begin with. He wouldn't have been foolish enough to do so otherwise. It's moving. Lionel wasn't sure at first, but he definitely hadn't moved his feet just now, but the barrier was definitely further out than it was originally. Was it here to protect him? Maybe there were much stronger beasts than what he could handle on the other side? That seemed to potentially be the case, considering this was a trial or tribulation of sorts. Suddenly, Lionel's pupils constricted. On the other side of the barrier, what must have been at least a few kilometers out, he actually saw another human. Lionel wasn't too shocked by this to begin with. There was no telling whether beasts were the only challenge ahead for him. After all, this was a spear trial, one for the king weapon of the battlefield. To use it solely against beasts, although this was where its roots lay, was a bit lacking for its status. However, the more Lionel looked, the more his shock increased, until his head spun so much that he didn't quite understand how to take what he was seeing. The youth several kilometers from him ran into the force field like he did, but seemed slightly more prepared than Lionel had been. His spear chipped at it first before his body came to a stop. Only then did he nod to himself and turn back. There was enough distance between him and Lionel that he didn't notice the latter, well, that and the fact there were so many trees and obstructions between them. Lionel only happened to have the perfect angle to see this young man. The young man landed on the ground and brandished a spear that looked practically identical to Lionel's own and pierced out toward a beast before him. He underwent an arduous battle, not much unlike Lionel. But what was truly shocking was the fact that everything was simply too similar. The spear domain lineage factor, the absolute spear domain, the crown of spears. After a long-fought battle, the young man finally managed to take down the beast. Without hesitation, he stuck his entire arm into the bloody eye socket of the beast, digging around in its brain until he found what he wanted and pulled out a bloody beast crystal. Then, under Lionel's widened gaze, he opened his mouth and swallowed it whole. His body bulged once before concentrating back down to his original size. His head suddenly turned in Lionel's direction. He paused for a long while, seemingly scanning Lionel up and down before he gave a bloodthirsty grin, the blood of the beast he had just killed drizzling down his cheek. Lionel's gaze narrowed as the young man picked up his spear and shot into the distance, his speed clearly much swifter than before. Even after several moments, Lionel didn't quite understand what was going on. This situation was far too weird. Lionel's heart shuddered and he realized that he had wasted far too much time here. At any time, a swarm of beasts could be attracted to this location. He couldn't allow himself to get caught with his pants down like that. He turned back, prepared to run away. What was obvious to him was that soon enough, if those barriers kept moving, his barrier would eventually overlap with that young man's and maybe even the barriers of other humans that may or may not be here. Obviously, his only opponents this time around wouldn't be human. He didn't know what it would take to perform to the standard his grandfather of the past had, or even surpass him, but there was no doubt that doing so would require battle with his fellow humanoids. Lionel's steps suddenly came to a pause and he shot back toward the wolf's corpse. He mimicked the actions of the young man and dug into its eye socket. He hesitated for a moment. There was no telling if that young man was special or not. Maybe he had a body that helped him digest beast crystals like this, or maybe he had a cheat. It looked like he was far more prepared for this tribulation than Lionel had been for some reason. T1L, take the risk. This wolf had no attributes to begin with, and it's not like absorbing beast crystals in unheard of. Lionel grit his teeth and swallowed the beast crystal, knowing full well just how foolish such a decision could be. But as things went, he had minimized the danger as much as he could. What he did know for sure was that if he couldn't improve his strength like that young man could, his only path forward was death. In that case, he might as well take the risk now. To Lionel's surprise, the moment the beast crystal hit his stomach, his body was flooded with strength. His brain fog, caused by his concussion, completely vanished, the cracks to his ribs healed, and the flesh wound to his chest began to close up. At the same time, his baseline of strength increased by leaps and bounds and he could feel himself growing more powerful. Lionel gripped his fists. It seemed that the beasts here weren't just a measure of whether or not he could survive, they were here as stepping stones to prepare him for the later trials. If he wanted to survive, he would have to hunt them all down. Brandishing his spear, Lionel dashed forward. His mind flickered with all sorts of thoughts, but they ultimately landed on just one image. The image of the ring on that young man's finger. The Spear Domain Ring. Chapter 1853. Published at 11th of May 2023 2:40 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1853. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1853. Queen Lionel didn't understand what the existence of that young man and the ring could possibly mean. In fact, he doubted that even if his ability index wasn't restrained that he would be able to figure it out. He simply didn't have enough information and everything was a jumbled mess. What Lionel did feel was correct, though, was that young man probably wasn't the only one. He had only checked one side and he presumed there was an entire region barred in around him. In that case, there were probably several other regions just like this one. If he was honest, though, he wasn't 100% certain of this either. For all he knew, they were the only two. Without his ability index, Lionel couldn't calculate something as complicated as how long it would take their two regions to become one, but what he did know was that there was a time limit. This was why he didn't waste time running along the barrier to check his hypotheses. He only had one life and he had to protect it well, and in this situation, that meant strengthening himself as much as possible, and as quickly as possible. Because he didn't have any internal sight to work with, Lionel couldn't just casually blanket hundreds of kilometers like he was used to and hunt down the beasts he was facing one by one, so he had to use other methods. This method is a bit dangerous, but it's the best I've got right now. Bait. Lionel extended his distance from the fallen wolf corpse after wiping his arm down to the best of his abilities using its fur coat. Lionel almost cut himself on the sharp bristles of its coat, but thankfully he realized the problem in time and ran his forearm and hand along the grain. At the same time, he made a mental note of this instance. With most of his advantages stripped from him, he had to take advantage of the ones he did have. His abilities and other lineage factors were gone, and his mind wasn't as fast as it normally was, but his memories and skills were still there. If the flesh of the wolf beast was so sturdy, its protective coat was definitely on another level. He had to find an opportunity to craft something more protective than the nonsense he was wearing right now. He might only have access to spear force, but force was still force. So long as it existed, he could use it to draw force arts. When Lionel had this thought, he felt his heart shudder. He had never really thought about the consequences of drawing force arts with other forces outside of soul and dream force, but just now he felt that it should naturally be possible. No, more specifically, he felt that it would be possible with spear force. This was a very clear and distinct difference because weapon forces were somewhat different from other forces. In fact, in some ways, it acted quite a bit like dream force, especially in the way it reacted to artistic conceptions. Lionel felt that he had gained another piece of the puzzle toward formulating the next level of his grandfather's spear technique. The first is here, Lionel thought, losing the strands of his other thoughts the moment he sensed a beast approaching. Unfortunately, in this state, he couldn't focus on more than one thing at a time. But right now, the evolution of his spear force was less important than strengthening his body as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Lionel wasn't ignorant to the fact that this breakthrough would also help his chances in this tribulation, but he was also aware that it was potentially fleeting while there was a very real opportunity for growth right beneath him. Lionel's gaze sharpened and he descended toward his first victim. In the outside world, a sort of silence had fallen in Lionel's absence. His disappearance had been silent, and yet it was almost immediately felt, almost as though a safety blanket had vanished. Everyone seemed to realize then what kind of looming presence he had only then. Even so, life was forced to go on, and due to Lionel's preparations, things remained smooth and steady, with progress moving quite seamlessly. On that day, Aina stepped out from her own personal seclusion. Other than the time she spent with Lionel, she had spent practically every waking minute meditation on the Blood Sovereign tablet. It could be said that her gains from it were no less than Lionel's gains from the Emperor's Might tablet. The only difference was that rather than being an additional ability of hers, it seamlessly fused into her current battle style, and as a result, her growth felt more exponential than linear. The first person Aina saw when she stepped out was actually Harmony. She sent a glance toward her with every intention of just ignoring her entirely, but to her surprise, it was actually Harmony herself that spoke. "Where is he? Why can't I sense him?" She interacted with the world on her own. She gained names like the Sword Monstress. It could be said that she wasn't very good at niceties. "He is currently busy," Aina replied simply. On her hand, though, there was a slight change, and that was the fact that Lionel's spear domain ring was actually now on her finger. Whether by conscious choice or not, it actually took the place a wedding ring should have had, something that Harmony seemed quite sensitive to. Harmony sneered. "There's no need to gatekeep his whereabouts. If I wanted to steal him from you, I would have done so long ago. Though I can't promise that my sister will be as nice as me. Since he's not here to tie me down, he'll just leave, then." Aina didn't seem to react to these words at all. Or, at the very least, her expression didn't shift. Even so, Harmony suddenly found that she couldn't move a single inch, and her pupils couldn't help but constrict. Aina didn't move an inch, and yet Harmony found her blood vessels constricting. Her heartbeat seemed to forcibly slow, and her skin reddened as blood rushed to the surface. Harmony's body pressed up against the wall as though a noose was pulling her up. She quickly found her feet dangling from the ground and the veins in her neck popping wildly as flashbangs went off in her vision. She seemed to be able to breathe just fine, and yet couldn't seem to get enough air at the same time. Fear took root deep within her heart. She had seen Aina many times during her stay here, how could she not? She had already been stuck here for several months. In fact, she vaguely knew that Aina was a target of the Three-Finger Cult and had even thought of snatching her while Lionel was gone. During this time, she hadn't felt a sense of threat from Aina at all. She had just assumed that Lionel had chosen her because she was so beautiful. It only felt right. The most powerful man would be with the most beautiful woman. It was a legend as old as time. Harmony had never seen Aina do anything but laugh and smile and cling on to Lionel every waking moment. In fact, she had felt a little disgusted by the act, making sweeping assumptions about their relationship. It was only now that Harmony knew exactly how wrong she was. The pressure she was feeling suddenly vanished and she fell to the ground with a heavy thump, her heart finally beginning to beat normally again. Aina walked away without another word, and Harmony could only watch as her back receded. It seemed that in the absence of the king, there was a more than capable queen. Aina's gaze flashed with its own cold light. If others wanted to test Earth because Lionel had disappeared for a short while, they could taste her axe. At that moment, in the depths of a hidden world, there was a storm brewing. News of what had happened to the four great families had yet to spread back to its normal channels, but this was only to be expected. With every last one of them having been wiped out by Lionel, who would be there to report back? However, there would, of course, be normal communication between the two sides. The fact that this contact had suddenly stopped abruptly and without warning was bound to raise its own sort of speculation. Unfortunately, there were very tight constraints on these four families. If there weren't, why would they incrementally release their people like this? As such, it had been impossible for them to send others to check on the situation for a long while. In an irony, though, Lionel's actions in assimilating so many world spirits with Earth's had stabilized the region ahead of time. The good news was that the number of powerful zones that appeared were less in number and frequency. The bad news was that the next batch of four great family geniuses could exit ahead of time, and these geniuses would be on a completely different level in comparison to the ones Lionel had originally faced. Lionel's queen would face her own challenge. Stepping out from seemingly thin air, a small group of red-haired and eyed young men and women appeared in the depths of Earth's wilderness. "Our base should be on the moon," one of them said. "We will head there first and question them about the lack of communication." Chapter 1854. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 37 seconds p.m. Chapter 1854. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1854. For the Brazingers only numbered 4. Their current head was a woman who went by Sarathana. She didn't seem to have anything particularly special about her. Her looks weren't too poor, nor were they too great. She wasn't too tall, nor was she too short. She wasn't too imposing, nor did she fade into the background. In fact, if one said that she was the leader among the 3, it would feel a bit ridiculous, especially since the one who had spoken was a young man. This young man was actually Sarathana's younger brother, and maybe this was the reason why he dared to speak in her stead at all. His name was Raffer, and unlike his sister, he was imposing and very noticeable for all the right reasons. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and he had an obvious air of command to him that made him the largest presence in almost any room he entered. But it was maybe due to this dichotomy that Sarathana was allowed to be the genius that she was. She didn't seem very interested in such things at all, so she was okay to allow her young brother to take the spotlight. The final 2 were 2 young men who went by Barian and the Dan. They seemed quite used to the interaction between the 2 siblings and didn't find it to be very off-putting at all. They simply took Raffer's words at face value and didn't think much about it. Even if they wanted to reject, what good would it do with that monstress by his side? She might look unassuming, but they were well aware of how dangerous she was. The group pulled out a flying treasure, prepared to make their way to the moon. But what they didn't expect was that the moment they entered Earth's airspace, they triggered a change. The 4 didn't make it far before they found themselves surrounded from all sides. Raffer's gaze narrowed. He hadn't expected this aggression, and even if he thought it might be a faint possibility, the speed with which they reacted also felt too fast. Since when had Earth reached this level, and why was it so different from their expectations? At that moment, the head ship of the fleet that had surrounded them opened up and a man wearing radiant golden armor stepped out. His eyes were a piercing blue and his hair fell like a rainfall of gold. This man was none other than Governor Duke Arthur Pendragon. Or, as most once called him, King Arthur. "I hate how right that Brad is sometimes, how annoying," Arthur mumbled beneath his breath. "I think you're actually more mad about him ordering you around, right, Dad?" Mordred's somewhat seductive laughter came from an adjacent ship, twirling what looked like a sleek black wand in her hand. Whether it was father or daughter, the both of them had auras within the 7th dimension. However, what was particularly interesting was that they didn't seem to have broken through using the conventional path, but it didn't seem to be the god path either. Of course, that was because they had broken through using Camelot's magic system. There was a reason the integration of Camelot with Earth was the ultimate reward of their mythological zone, a reward Lionel only gained after clearing the hidden quest and resolving their love triangle. By succeeding in that endeavor, Lionel had planted a seed for the protection of Earth that was bearing fruit now. Camelot had just needed a little push, and with Lionel's return, they were truly blooming into their own. Arthur grumbled. Although he had never said it out loud, he had every intention of surpassing Lionel and suppressing him one day, which was funny considering he had started off so much higher than Lionel to begin with. He could still remember all the arrogant things that little boy had done the first time he visited his kingdom. But now, he, the mighty Arthur Pendragon, was basically just a lackey. How sad. Shying. Arthur unsheathed his sword, a radiant golden light echoing through the world. Without a word, he vanished into a beam of light, his body losing its form as he moved forward at impossible-to-track speeds. The pupils of the 4 constricted. "Abandon ship," Raffer commanded. Shying. Arthur shot by in a blazing ray of light as the 4 of them didn't hesitate to jump down toward the earth below. When Arthur appeared again, he was standing in the exact same spot, his hand still on his sword hilt. For a moment, the flying ship the 4 Brazinger youths had stood upon seemed to be completely normal, but in the next instant, a blade cut as clean as a mirror's surface appeared, slicing it down the middle. Arthur watched coldly as the 4 youths fell to the earth below, his aura imposing. However, at that moment, a snort came from his side. Show off. You don't get extra points for being flashy, you know, Dad, Modred laughed. Arthur's cool demeanor vanished. He was speechless. Shouldn't daughters look toward their fathers as their superheroes? He actually had superhero-like powers and still couldn't get his daughter to treat him well. Where was the justice? Follow after them, we can't let them get too comfortable, was the only thing Arthur could say. It's too late, they're gone. They were likely prepared for a worst-case scenario like this. I didn't even see what method they used to vanish like that, Arthur's son, Leonis spoke. In that case, there's only really two options for them. Either return to their world for reinforcements or they're going to meet up with the other three families. Lionel said it's most likely the second. There should be some restrictions on how easily they can move into and out of that world of theirs. The best they can likely do for now is send a message back, Mordred replied. Arthur almost rolled his eyes at the mention of Lionel again, but he didn't say anything to refute it. Anyway, let the others know what's happened. They're here now, so we have to be ready for retaliation, especially when they've found out what's happened to their people. Chapter 1855. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 37 seconds p.m. Chapter 1855. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1855. Finite. When Aina received the news, her gaze became frighteningly cold. She moved to stand, but it was Yuri who placed a hand on hers. Aina looked over, her gaze still quite scary. However, Yuri only smiled lightly, seemingly quite used to this. Maybe only she and Lionel could face this look of Aina's. I know you want to make them pay as soon as possible, but you also have other responsibilities here, no? Yuri asked softly. Hearing this, Aina took a breath and exhaled. That was right. Currently, she wasn't Aina Brazinger. For all intents and purposes, she was currently Aina Morales. She had sworn to herself that she wouldn't change her name until the Brazinger family most wanted her to have it. However, for Lionel, she was willing to forget that vow for a while. In Lionel's presence, she was allowed to be as willful as she wanted. But in his absence, she had to step into his role. She wasn't as good of a leader as Lionel was, but at the very least, she had to be present. If she went off looking for murder, who would take care of things back here? You're right, Aina said lightly before she exhaled a final breath and calmed down entirely. She looked down at her ring finger. She had put the ring there purposely to remind herself. It wasn't for the sake of being googly-eyed and in love, that was the furthest thing from her personality. It was an anchor to remind herself not to lose herself in her murderous intent. Then do things the smart way. Have the Ray Lion and the others spread out their information network to track their whereabouts. This won't be difficult. Once they gather up support from the representatives they send from the other three families, deal with them all in a single sweep. This was Earth's territory, and the playground they had just stepped into was in Lionel's backyard. If they thought just a handful of people could overturn the skies and shatter the Earth, they would be sorely mistaken. Yuri nodded and began to do as Aina had said. No matter what, ever since their youth, she had always been Aina's guiding hand. Sometimes it was hard to tell if they were a pair of sisters or mother and daughter, but regardless, they were very close. I'll go speak to the others about remaining alert. Since battle could come at any time, it wouldn't be a good idea to lose themselves in training. Aina stood and began to make rounds through the flagship. Her fists clenched and unclenched before her thumb spun the ring on her finger. Even in its dormant state, the spear domain ring gave her quite a bit of warmth. K. Lionel dodged out of the way of a claw. His body was covered from head to toe in injuries, but his gaze was sharp and relentless. All around him, beasts of all shapes and sizes charged. Compared to the past where he would avoid them even in a one-on-one situation, but it could only be said that Lionel was a madman. This horde wasn't something he had accidentally triggered, but rather something he had triggered on purpose. And at the moment, he had nowhere to take a step back because there was nothing but the force field to his back. As for why Lionel had chosen to do things this way outside of being a madman, he wanted to save time. With the force field to his back, he didn't have to worry about being encircled. To his left and right, corpses of beasts were quickly piling up and adding much more to the blockade. All he had to do now was focus on the beasts right in front of him, beasts that seemed to be getting larger and larger. After seeing the young man, Lionel had been constantly thinking about how he could get ahead. The young man's spear domain lineage factor seemed to be on par with his own, his bodily strength was about on par, his weapon was about on par. So how could Lionel get an edge? Usually, the answer to that question was just to rely on his ability index. His mind was sharper, his reactions were faster, and he was simply more intelligent. However, he had completely lost this advantage. While Lionel still felt he was more intelligent than most people, without the benefit of speed of thought and split minds, the margin was too narrow for it to cause any large swings in any one direction. It could be said that compared to other geniuses, Lionel wasn't too much more intelligent than them, or at the very least, it wasn't exaggerated. He was probably 0.1 standard deviations ahead of most geniuses, which wasn't a small amount, but it wasn't obscene either. What stacked this advantage so greatly against his enemies was how many minds he had working at once and how fast he could think. By the time another person deduced using their intelligence once, Lionel would have done so billions of times over. The winner was, then, obvious. However, without this advantage, while Lionel was intelligent still, his application was lacking. Lionel realized that if he continued meandering about, his success after this point would be up to luck, something that was unacceptable to him. So, he decided to force the issue, and he thought about how one would gain an advantage in this situation. His crafting skills weren't enough. Without little Tolly in his dream world, what he could make would be limited in use, and without his ability index, he would be too slow in making them. At best, he would be able to focus on just a single thing before he was forced to face the other participant or potentially participants in this tribulation. He needed a different sort of advantage, or at least a method of maximizing the advantage he did have better. And that was when Lionel thought of it. This was a finite space. Although the force field was moving, it was doing so very slowly, and he had yet to see any beasts crossing the barrier, which meant that they were restricted by the same means he was. In that case, the most important commodity here was actually these beasts themselves. Chapter 1856. Published at 16th of May 2023, 12:25 and 37 seconds p.m. Chapter 1856. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1856. A joke. Lionel asked himself a very simple question. What was the measure of success in this place in the rawest terms? He was able to find the answer by making one simple assumption. The goal of this first phase was to swallow beast crystals and strengthen yourself. With that assumption made, the answer was obvious. The measure of success was how many beasts you could kill. In that case, what Lionel had to do was even more obvious: kill as many beasts as he could, and even more ideally than that, kill them all. This was where the importance of the fact that this place was finite came into place. The fact that there was a finite amount of space meant that there was a finite number of beasts. And if there was a finite number of beasts, then logically, to perfectly clear this region, one had to kill every last one of them. So then the question became, how could Lionel use his unique advantages to force this end result? Due to these lines of thought, Lionel ended up in this situation, bleeding from head to toe, still lacking any sort of defenses outside of his own flesh and bone, and wielding a spear so dull it could only rely on his spear force to give it an edge. After finding a good region near the force field barrier, Lionel drew a force art with his spear force that could mimic a force eruption. And now, he was paying dearly for it. Lionel drew in heavy breaths, but his grip on his spear didn't slacken. After dodging the claw, he stepped outside of the tiger beast's body and his arm clamped it down to his torso. When the tiger beast tried to twist its head toward him to bite his head off, he sent a powerful punch at its long teeth while still holding onto his spear, shattering them. Blood and tooth fragments rained down, but Lionel had already switched his grip and pierced right through the tiger's eye, mincing its brain to pieces. Lionel released its claw and sent out a fierce kick, sending the tiger's body sprawling toward the next wave. Taking a step forward, Lionel pierced out with his spear, splitting the blade 6 different directions and forcing the second wave after the next back. His crowd control was immaculate as he hacked them down one by one, and his slaughter was relentless. Lionel realized then that his only advantage wasn't just his force crafting. The changes the Silver Empire's inheritance had made to his body were still there. There were still countless more folds in his heart, several more blood vessels carrying oxygen through his body, and his heart was still several times larger than it had been in the past, along with having more chambers. If he could use his mind and spear to force these beasts to fight him one-on-one or two-on-one, he definitely wouldn't be the first to tire. It felt like it only took a single big breath for his body to be refueled and rejuvenated. He continued his relentless slaughter, kicking corpses out of the way from time to slaughter more. He fell into a complete rhythm, and his blade strike seemed to paint a picture across the skies, his polearm floating as though it was being carried by the wind and caressed by the sun's rays. Silence fell, and the roars of the beasts didn't seem to echo any longer. The melody of Lionel's spear was all there was. The greatest shame of losing his ability index was that Lionel could no longer rely on Dream Class to execute his grandfather's way of the spear. This was why he hadn't used Swift or Forceful, or any of the other stances he had stored away. But at that moment, his spear seemed to have become ingrained into his very being. No, more accurately, he had come to realize that the part of his brain that the spear domain lineage factor had modified to be more in tune with the spear had saved all of these movements within his muscle memory. Ironically, for the first time, Lionel truly listened to his spear without filtering it through logic and reason, only because he simply didn't have the luxury to. His mind wasn't currently running fast enough to think and scheme in the middle of battle, and he had become like everyone else, relying on their instincts and training. It was just that Lionel hadn't realized just how much instinct he had built up until this moment. Suddenly, he needed no more than a single strike to shatter the life force of the beasts before him. He walked out from the force field, seemingly no longer needing it to his back. His spear became faster and faster, and for a moment, in the back of his head, he faintly laughed at himself. That young man? As skilled as him? Isn't that what he had said before? What a joke. That young man wasn't even a tenth as powerful as he was. The radiant spear crown shone with a fiercer and fiercer light. Lionel pierced out, his spear splitting into three. This time, he didn't even aim for the enormous eye sockets of the beasts before him. And yet, their nigh indestructible coats of fur were shredded like wet paper beneath his blade, and he shattered their skulls in a single strike. The attack was so smooth that he didn't even face a hint of backlash facing three of them at once. Lionel's spear drew an arc through the air. Blood flew and head spun, mournful cries echoing through the forest. A bloodthirstiness wafted from Lionel, his blade snaking through the skies like a river of flowing crimson blood. Everywhere he passed, another beast would fall, and then another. The spear crown upon his forehead grew more and more condensed, the middle spear growing in size. PCHU. Roar. A baleful cry left Lionel's lips as his spear thrust forward. It felt like a blade strike that could split the ocean's tides, several thousands of miles of deep, black waters, as though they were nothing at all. Everywhere the spear force passed, beasts were shredded to pieces. Lionel suddenly came to a stop and took a deep breath. All the wind for hundreds of meters rushed toward him at its fastest speed, suturing his lungs in an instant. After that singular breath, his breathing became even and unhurried. He stood amid hundreds of corpses looking for more beasts when he suddenly realized something. He had already killed them all. Chapter 1857. Published at 16th of May 2023, 12:25 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1857. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1857 to know. Lionel's gaze flickered as he quickly looked around. He hadn't expected to kill them all so easily. Actually, if he was honest with himself, he couldn't quite remember whether it was easy or not. He had been in a state of complete forgetfulness, something he had never before experienced. Lionel shook his head. Right now, this was actually a good thing. Leaning on his talent a bit, especially when he didn't have his ability index, would be the best way to maximize his chances at victory. After a minor moment of hesitation, Lionel rushed forward and began plucking the beast crystals out from these beasts. During the battle, he obviously hadn't had a chance to do so, so now he had some making up to do. The more he swallowed, the greater flood of strength that entered his body. His body was like a dry riverbed finally experiencing its first rainfall after countless months. But what was especially odd was that Lionel didn't feel like he was regaining his previous strength. It both felt like his own body, and yet not like his body at all. Lionel realized it was incorrect to say that the beast crystals were allowing him to regain his former strength. Rather, he was just building up the strength of this temporary body. But this wasn't necessarily a bad thing either. After all, if he was facing other enemies, who was to say that his sixth-dimensional strength wouldn't be too weak? This way, everyone was at the same starting level. It took Lionel longer than he thought it would to swallow all the beast crystals, but that couldn't be helped considering the sturdiness of these beasts and the sheer number of them that there were. After he was done, he turned his attention elsewhere. He scanned the pile of beasts before he landed on a 3. One was a hawk with a wingspan of over 10 meters, the second was a Komodo dragon creature with thick greenish-black scales, and the last was a white-furred wolf who, even in death, looked exceptionally beautiful. It was hard to tell that it had died at all, but that was also because Lionel had purposely left its lush coat intact. Lionel walked over to the hawk and hacked down at one of its large claws, severing one of its legs from its corpse. He held the large appendage that was just over half his height and examined it for a moment. He touched the tough leathery scales that coated it, then flicked a finger at the actual claws before nodding to himself. He then went over to the Komodo dragon and skinned it before repeating the same process with the white-furred wolf. After he was done, he prepared the rest of his raw materials and cleaned them all in a nearby lake. Lionel walked to the side of a dead porcupine creature and raked a gaze over its body before he found a perfect-sized needle and pulled it out. After puncturing a hole in its blunt base, he began to form force threads. Lionel was used to using little tali in place of threads, or more accurately, this was the method of force sewing his father had taught him. But the most important aspect of the sewing was the fusion, and Lionel felt that if his spear force control was high enough, he could replicate the feat losing himself. Lionel didn't focus on the time or anything else. After setting up force art protections around himself, he put his all into force crafting. The process was a lot slower than he was used to, but it also really allowed him to hone in on his weaknesses. For example, he wasn't very good at drawing force arts without a perfect replica to follow from his dream world. As such, he was forced to slow his drawing process and really think about every rune he drew. This process actually deepened his understanding and tied down loose ends he hadn't even been aware existed. His skill as a force crafter increased by leaps and bounds, and soon, just a few hours later, Lionel felt that he was ready. He donned his new armor. The gorgeous white fur of the wolf took center stage, making up most of it. However, in between and hidden in important regions, the black-green scales of the Komodo dragon added a nice hint of accent to the blinding white. On Lionel's hands and forearms were a pair of gauntlets he had constructed out of the claws of the hawk. Hidden within the flat of his forearm, a blade formed from its claw extended and then retracted. On his feet, there was a pair of boots modeled in the same style as his gauntlets. Lionel slammed his fists into one another and the sound of a resonant energy formed. Hidden within the armor, gauntlets, and boots, a force art solidified them all into one entity. Reaching out a hand, Lionel's spear flew into his palm and he exhaled a breath. He turned toward his force field again. He wanted to see how much time there was left before he fused with another cornered-off region. But, to Lionel's surprise, when he touched the force field this time, his armored hand slipped right through it. Lionel's gaze flickered. Is this the benefit of clearing your bubble? This seemed like the only plausible explanation. Lionel nodded to himself as he moved forward and broke out into a sprint. It seemed it was time to truly unleash unholy hell. Because he had taken his time to build this armor first, there was no telling if others had stepped out before him, so it was about time he unleashed his own killing spree. But first, he had to find one of the other participants. He wanted to find out exactly what was going on here. Why were there multiple spear domain rings? Was there really more than one in the universe? Or were they just participants from past tribulations? Or maybe incarnations created to challenge him but didn't truly exist? He had to know. Chapter 1858. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1858 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1858 Kill Me. Lionel's speed was much greater than it had been before as he entered the bubble of the young man he had seen earlier. He thought it would be smartest if he entered more known territory. Not only was he certain that there was a person here to target, but he was also of a strength Lionel was confident in dealing with. Lionel's steps paused for a moment and he turned back, pressing a hand toward the force field. The force field rippled, but stopped his hand from passing through. It seemed that by stepping into this region, he had locked himself into a cage and he couldn't retreat as he pleased. That much was fine. He had considered the possibility of this happening, which was why he had chosen a known location to begin with. Turning back, Lionel shot into the distance again, leaping into the trees agilely and vanishing into the foliage. He moved forward without a single hint of a sound, scanning the region quickly with his eyes. It was impossible to lure out this enemy like he had the beasts of his bubble. Humans might be intrigued by a force eruption, but there was a more likely than not chance that if the young man sensed a force eruption, given his strength, he would stay quite a distance away from it. He likely wouldn't take the risk if he didn't have to. So Lionel had to find him on his own. The good news was that Lionel's senses were much sharper after absorbing so many beast crystals. So, he cut a straight line through the closed-off bubble, paying keen attention. His ears twitched every so often. Finally, he caught the faint sounds of battle. He changed direction, gliding through the trees and moving up higher as he moved. Eventually, he could sense the strands of spear force gliding through the air and he locked onto a battle occurring about 300 meters ahead of him. The young man stood his ground as he faced off against two beasts. He was clearly much stronger than he had been when Lionel last saw him, and his confidence and battle style proved this much. However, after observing him for a while, Lionel felt that he was no threat at all. Without waiting for the battle to conclude, Lionel suddenly leapt forward. He pushed off of the trunk of the tree he stood within with such force that it bent in the opposite direction far enough to nearly touch the ground. The young man was completely caught off guard by Lionel's sudden appearance on the battlefield, but before he could react, Lionel's absolute spear domain had already shredded the two beasts he landed between to pieces. The pupils of the young man constricted. He immediately felt the potency of Lionel's spear force and it caused him to shudder. His own absolute spear domain erupted in an attempt to counter Lionel's, but it was shredded to pieces as well, crumbling before his eyes. Lionel took a step forward, closing the distance. Seeing that the situation wasn't good, the young man pierced forward with his spear, trying to catch Lionel off guard and make him pay for his nonchalance. However, Lionel simply tapped them with a finger, his spear force suffocating the young man's. The young man's spear was blown to the side as Lionel's own thrust forward, nailing the former right in the collarbone and pressing forward until he was nailed to a tree. The young man roared out in pain and tried to swing out with his spear in vain, but Lionel's hand grabbed its polearm with one hand, released his grip on his own spear, and then used it to grab the young man's throat, suffocating the rest of his pained outcry. In just a few exchanges, the young man found himself weaponless and restricted. He couldn't even move an inch without the spear through his collarbone making his body shudder with pain. When he looked at Lionel's face, there couldn't help but be a hint of defiance on it that masked a lingering fear. He had seen Lionel before, but back then, he had been very confident in his abilities. It had only been about 3/4 of a day. How had someone who had been his equal become so powerful? No, it was simply impossible for someone with spear force this powerful to have shown the kind of weakness he saw from Lionel earlier, nor was it possible for there to be such vast improvement in the span of a day. It didn't make any sense. Lionel was about to begin questioning the man before him, but to his surprise, he felt an odd pull from the young man's spear. Subconsciously, Lionel felt that if he touched his spear to the young man's spear, it would upgrade to a new level. Lionel tucked this information into the back of his mind and released his grip on the young man's throat slightly. Rho Alpha D Alpha Na what is your name? The young man was trying to decide what to do at this point. If he struggled, he might just die. But if things ended like this, so would his tribulation. He hadn't even cleared his bubble yet. This wasn't even enough for the lowest tier of clear. When he went back, his spear domain ring wouldn't even acknowledge him and he would have to pass it to someone new. This was simply far too frustrating. However, when he heard Lionel's question, he was a bit surprised. Why was he asking this? The young man forced himself to calm down. Ultimately, he was a genius among geniuses. There was a very obvious reason he had been able to get to this step. Even in this situation, he hadn't fallen to despair just yet. He didn't really want to answer Lionel's question, but maybe there would be a chance to find an escape route if he delayed. My name is Nelligan Trudeau. Lionel frowned. He didn't recognize that name or family. Nelligan, where are you from? Hearing these words, the young man suddenly understood. His astonishment was painted all over his face. Oh, you're from one of them. I can't believe I actually lost to someone from one of them. My dad's gonna kill me. Chapter 1859. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1859. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1859. Cheating. Nelligan hadn't shown a hint of despair all this time, but the moment he seemed to have deduced something, it felt like his world was crumbling. He spoke about losing to Lionel as though he tried to snatch candy from a baby and actually ended up failing. Lionel frowned. From one of them? What was that supposed to mean? One of them? What does that mean? Nelligan stopped flailing about and looked Lionel dead in the eyes. He didn't seem like he was going to say anything at all, until Lionel suddenly lightly touched the spear pierced into his shoulder. Although Nelligan didn't make a single sound, his jaw still set. It was clear that he was clenching his teeth quite hard, but he tried his best to hide it. Unfortunately, even without his ability index, something like that couldn't escape Lionel's attention. I'll ask again. What does that mean? Nelligan sucked in a cold breath and shook his head. Go fuck yourself. If you don't know, then tell you. You tell me, what would you choose between dying and your family? You're not going to get anything out of me. Lionel frowned. He didn't understand what these words were supposed to mean. Why did giving this information to him place Nelligan's family in danger? Lionel looked into Nelligan's eyes, but he already knew that it was a futile expert. Of all the emotions he had seen Nelligan display, none of them had been fear, even when Lionel could have taken his life with a single stroke. It was clear that Nelligan, although weak, was someone with backbone. What a load of horseshit. Nelligan mumbled beneath his breath. Since when did those places have someone capable of suppressing their spear force to this extent? Lionel thought about just taking Nelligan's spear and leaving. If there wasn't any information to be gained, then this was all worthless. He felt that it wasn't necessary to kill someone, taking his spear and kicking him out would be enough. But then Lionel realized something else. Alright, I'll let you go on one condition. Tell me everything you know about this tribulation. If you don't, or I catch you lying to me, your family can wait for your corpse. Nelligan didn't seem to be as opposed to this. This wasn't a big deal. But then he lamented the fact that he had actually lost to someone who had no idea what was going on. Nelligan assumed that Lionel must be the first to trigger the complete tribulation, or else he wouldn't be so clueless. To make matters worse, since Lionel was so clueless, then that meant that he had gained an idea of what to do by observing him back then. If not for Lionel spotting him before, he would have no idea that he could ingest beast crystals in this world. Nelligan really felt like kicking himself. This was worse than dropping a weight on your foot or even shooting it. He might as well have nuked his entire leg off. He had basically created the man who kicked him out of this tribulation. This is the complete tribulation. It's different from the 3-section tribulation as it will only appear once. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Nelligan had corrected a thought he had almost immediately. He had assumed that there would be 3 of these tribulations exactly like this one. What had triggered this? Could it be what happened that day he lost consciousness in the Void Tower? What's the goal of this complete tribulation? Territory conquering. You're already doing just fine, Nelligan said, his saltiness clearly evident in his words. By clearing all the beasts in your territory, you gain the right to leave it and attack another. If you defeat the ruler of that territory, you get their spear and can upgrade your own. In addition, your territory will fuse with theirs. This will cause stronger beasts to begin to spawn, giving you a better shot at absorbing stronger beast crystals and benefiting more. Lionel's irises flickered. How does this end? What are the levels of completion? Clearing one territory is the basic pass and can grant you the black reward. 10 for bronze, 100 for silver, 1,000 for gold. As for how it ends, that depends. Usually it's when there's only one participant remaining. Sometimes it's when there's been a stalemate for too long. At other times it's when all of the remaining participants have decided to accept their rewards and move on. It's possible for you to leave right now if you wanted and just accept a basic pass. There are that many participants at once? No. Humanoids aren't the only ones who command territories. There are special territories with king beasts and there are some with powerful and unique spears in control of them that can spawn warriors. Any combination of these works. Humanoids. It's not just humans. Of course not. In fact, humans are probably the minority in this place. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Nelligan's words seemed to imply something. It was likely that the people in the know about these matters were more likely than not human. It seemed that once again, the human race was lagging too far behind. What else aren't you telling me? Lionel asked. For the rules, that's really all there is. The rest are little details. It would make no difference if I told you or not. If I tried to list them all, you'd be here all day and you'd only fall behind the others. Then what about the competitors? If what you mean to do is ask for my advice, then I advise that after you claim 10 territories, you cut your losses and accept the bronze reward. Lionel frowned. Why's that? For one, the bronze reward is already enough for you to rule over your little corner since you come from one of them. And secondly, if you try to push for silver, claiming 100 territories will definitely put you in their line of sight. You'll already be lucky to not run into them after claiming 10. Who's them? The other races, of course. Why should I fear the other races? Aren't they suppressed just like we are in this place? Nelligan looked at Lionel and shook his head. In this place, we're all stripped down to our baseline and left with nothing more than our spear force. You think about it, humans versus the other races, who has the higher baseline? Without our lineage factors and ability indexes, we're screwed. However, their abilities are too ingrained into their very bodies to be completely suppressed. The Raypaks will always have exceptionally strong bodies and no amount of suppression is going to remove the metal that coats their bodies. The Cloud race's shifting ability is ingrained into their very person. Although they can't shift in this place, they can still analyze all of your abilities and counter them with a change in the battle style. And the worst cheaters of them all, the spirituals, still have souls separate from their bodies. While their bodies are suppressed, the suppression to their souls is much weaker because it needs to be. After all, your real body is in suspended animation right now. It's your soul that's occupying this puppet body for you to use. If it was suppressed too, everything that made you, would be gone and then there wouldn't be a point to these trials. Some of those bastards can use their affinities and even portions of their lineage factors. You think about it, what chance do humans stand, exactly? Chapter 1860. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1860. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1860. Resounding. Lionel fell into silence. This was, indeed, a troublesome issue. But if what Nelligan said was true, then technically, shouldn't he have such advantages too? After all, his soul was also separated from his body. So why was it that he hadn't sensed anything special? However, when he thought back to what Nelligan had said, his frown deepened. According to what he had said, this tribulation world was still able to suppress spirituals, it was just that the suppression wasn't perfect. The spirituals were still able to take advantage of their affinities, which likely meant that they could use forces outside of just spear force. The spear domain lineage factor made this ability exception. Those with this lineage factor were able to fuse all forces with their spear force. Their spear was a perfect conduit or vessel for their other forces. To keep this matter simple, if the spiritual could use other forces here, they were exceptionally dangerous. The trouble here was that humans and spirituals weren't of the same race. Although Lionel had had a hypothesis that they shared the same root, he had yet to be able to confirm this. Plus, even if they did, they had branched out in their evolution enough that this fact might not even matter. Eggless novel COM essentially, humans stored their affinities within their bodies and the changes that occurred within them. Spirituals, however, carried all of their DNA within their souls. The greatest difference was that as long as their soul was intact, a spiritual goal rebuild their ethereal glabella, but if Lionel's ethereal glabella was ever destroyed, he would be finished. This was all to say that from what it seemed here, Lionel didn't have the same advantages even though his soul was separate from his body. He couldn't even sense his greatest affinities, dream force and fire force. Wait. Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. He definitely couldn't sense fire force, but was it true that he couldn't sense dream force? In fact, hadn't his spear force felt like an extension of his dream and soul force when he used it as a replacement when he drew the force arts that formed his current armor? Suddenly, it all clicked for Lionel at once. He couldn't access any of his other talents, but there was one of his talents that was firmly rooted in his soul, his king's might lineage factor. From the very beginning, it was the only one of his lineage factors that did elicit changes in his body but rather did so to his soul. While the lineage factor itself was currently suppressed, what wasn't suppressed was the dream force affinity that came with it. Lionel realized then that he didn't have an advantage similar to that of the spirituals, it was just far less obvious, and it was difficult to tell how he would be able to apply it. It had to be remembered that Lionel was incapable of projecting his dream force out of his body. It was only after he gained Thila's innate node that he was able to. But now, he obviously didn't have access to it any longer. This meant that just like before, Lionel was fairly limited in what he could do. Outside of drawing force arts using his spear as medium, it would be difficult to use it in other ways. After a moment of silence, Lionel's mind flashed with a few thoughts and he nodded to himself, his confidence soaring. This was a tribulation of the spear. He didn't care what advantages they had, so long as their blades weren't as sharp as his own, they would lose. It was that simple. Go. Lionel said coldly. He snatched Nelligan's spear and pulled his own out of the latter's shoulder. With a thought, the two spears fused and what was left, although still of low quality, was still much better. The crooked wood was now as straight as a javelin, the blade had lengthened, and Lionel could feel its sharpness with a touch of his finger. Nelligan opened his mouth to say something but just shook his head in the end as his body began to fade away. He could tell that Lionel had no intention of listening to his advice. In fact, Lionel had already begun to draw something in the dirt. It didn't take Nelligan long to realize that it was actually a force art. Just when he thought it was futile, a surge of force came forth from the surroundings. The last thing Nelligan saw was a horde of beasts rushing over. Not long after Lionel cleared Nelligan's territory, he left to another, and then another. Back to back to back, he cleared a total of 5 territories and his speed was only increasing. Lionel realized that he had to maintain this pace until the specialty territories began to appear. The later he was to enter a territory, the fewer beasts there would be remaining, and the fewer beast crystals he would be able to consume to increase his strength. Although one could gather territory by stealing the spear of someone who had already conquered many, doing things that way would be like leaving power on the table because you wouldn't be able to absorb strength someone else already had. Lionel's steps came to a pause and his eyes narrowed. By now, his armor had evolved several times and he looked not much different from a hooded hermit wrapped in white furs and blackish leather. Even so, his movements were just as agile and even far swifter than they had been before. Up ahead, Lionel caught sight of a rapax, its oblong-shaped head glistening with a blackish-silver metal-like carapace. This was the first non-human individual he had met, and the difference felt particularly striking. For one, he could see that the rapax spear was already upgraded, which meant that it had already conquered other territories. But more importantly than that, it too was fighting several beasts at once without the slightest hint of fatigue. Even so, Lionel stomped a foot onto the ground, not hiding his presence in the slightest as he barreled forward. He didn't just want a victory, he wanted a resounding victory. Chapter 1861. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1861. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1861. Unfairness. The Raypak seemed to sense Lionel almost immediately. It was far too difficult for Lionel to tell what its emotions were, especially without his ability index, but the slight hitch in its actions, despite the fact it had reacted so smoothly before, seemed to suggest that it was actually surprised that a human was coming at him. This was no normal Raypaks, it was coded in golden runes that Lionel had only seen on the most talented of Raypaks. In fact, when he thought back, only Raypaks of the 7th dimension had had these runes. This wasn't to say that only Raypaks of that level could have such things, but rather that all those who had had such runes had the talent to enter the 7th dimension with their unique path. What was more important than this, though, was the fact that the Raypaks had runes at all. This definitely meant that it had received more than a generic body when it entered this place, speaking to the unfairness spoken about before. Even so, that wouldn't stop him. Lionel's figure flickered and he slid by the beasts as though he didn't exist. Not a single one of them reacted to his appearance and to the Raypak's further shock. The beasts treated no differently than one of them, ignoring him and continuing to attack the Raypaks. The Raypaks blocked a lunging elephant beast with his spear. At the same time, his tail whipped toward Lionel like a whip. In some sort of weird martial art, it lifted its leg in a violent frontal kick all at once. Without fail, each attack was matched with a viciously sharp spear force. Eggless novel C.O.M. Lionel's pale violet gaze remained frighteningly cold, but inwardly he had confirmed Nelligan's words several times over in just a single exchange. The Raypaks were close combat experts, and they were also practically immune to soul force to the point they couldn't be seen with internal sight. They didn't tend to use weapons and relied on their bodies instead, as they lacked the affinity for it. But if one of them was born to be a spearman like the one right before Lionel, the combination of spearmanship and close combat skills would be exceptional. And now this was no longer a vague theory in Lionel's mind, but was rather a very clear reality. Every single part of this Raypak seemed to be another spear pointed right for Lionel. Lionel's absolute spear domain thrummed to life. Scree! The Raypaks released a war cry, seemingly wanting to intimidate Lionel. Rather than pausing, its attack became fiercer, pressing down with a vicious momentum. Bang! Spiraling domain of spear force, tail and leg met. However, rather than going right through like he had expected, the Raypaks found itself in a stalemate. Having underestimated Lionel, he found himself entangled for far longer than he thought he would be, and because it was still dealing with other beasts, it couldn't do much as Lionel's spear snaked forward, its blade appearing between the natural plated armor that covered its body. The Raypak seemed to enter another odd stance of its martial art. Using the momentum of its rebound against Lionel's absolute spear domain, its leg and tail drew back and pulled its body into a half-spin that shrunk Lionel's target. Lionel's spear passed through, drawing a line of blood through the joint in the Raypak's natural armor, but it wasn't the deep and devastating cut he had wanted. At the same time, the elephant beast's trunk swung and knocked the Raypaks away. Lionel could tell with a glance that the Raypaks absorbed this blow on purpose, arching through the air, flipping once, and then landing agilely on its digitigrade feet. The Raypaks hopped once as though it was loosening his body, but this casual leap of his easily brought him 10 meters into the air before he landed. The elephant beast quickly caught up and tried to follow up, thinking it had the upper hand, but with his eyes still locked onto Lionel, the Raypak swung out his spear just once and severed the beast's head. The elephant beast kept rushing forward as though it was still alive. It crashed through dozens of meters worth of trees before it finally came to a stop. The other beasts that tried to take advantage of the situation were instantly shredded by the Raypak's own absolute spear domain. Lionel didn't follow up immediately, calmly meeting what he thought was the Raypak's gaze. "You aren't bad, human." Lionel's heart skipped a beat. He was a bit shocked because this was the first time he had heard a Raypak speak, or maybe it was more accurate to say that this was the first time a Raypak saying something was properly translated for him. He hadn't put any effort into learning the Raypak's language when he last met them, so it was only right he hadn't understood anything they were saying. But it seemed that this tribulation did the translation for him. It's rare to see a suppressor among the humans, and that armor should be self-made, right? Judging by your spear, You've already conquered 5 territories already. How'd you indeed? Because he could emulate force eruptions, Lionel's clearing speed for territories was actually the fastest, or at the very least, if it wasn't, he should be near the very top. Even this golden ruined Rapax had only cleared 1 territory up until now. This was his second and he was about 75% finished. How could he not be interested after seeing this? Lionel tilted his head to the side until he heard a satisfying crack. He didn't bother to ask what a suppressor was. From the context clues he had gained from Nelligan, a suppressor should be someone who restricted their spear force in order to first chase perfection. More importantly, if Lionel hadn't suppressed his spear force, he would have been dropped into a tribulation with those with 6-dimensional spear force. At that point, he probably wouldn't stand a chance no matter how fast he cleared territories, if he could clear them at all, that is. I always thought that Rapax were silent warriors. I didn't expect a genius among them to be so talkative. You're single-handedly ruining the image I have for your race. I hope your blade is stronger than your tongue. The Rapax didn't say anything to this, but his aura seemed to darken. What an arrogant human. There was only a moment of silence, and then a rush of wind, before the two suddenly vanished, their spears crossing. Chapter 1862. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1862. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1862. Battle Prowess. Bang. 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 Lionel pressed forward with a furious speed. It was clear that his spear force was sharper and his reactions were quicker. At the same time, his strength output was beyond that of the Rapax. After all, he had cleared 5 territories while the Rapax was still working on its second. However, the combat style of the Rapax was unpredictable and it flowed exceptionally smoothly. All parts of his body seemed to become a spear. It was to the point where it was difficult to tell whether he was a true spearman or if he was a close combat expert instead. Lionel's spear separated into 6 blades, attacking all the vital points of the Rapax at once. The Rapax young man reacted with 3 of his own, but what was surprising was that his tail also split into 3, matching Lionel with a total of 6. Lionel's timing was thrown slightly off by this. The Rapax 3 spear collided against him first with a purely forward pressure, but the 3 tails followed up with a more sideswiping momentum. The delay between the 2 destabilized Lionel's spear and opened up his guard. Suddenly, the Rapax foot appeared before Lionel's chest, clearly having expected exactly this sort of lapse. Lionel didn't have the time to block and could only try to twist away. Unfortunately, he was a step slow and a claw coated with radiant gold spear force shot across his chest, taking with it a strong impact that knocked the air out of his lungs. With a grunt, Lionel spun and shot backward at the same time, the armor that protected him deflecting much of the pressure. He realized immediately that had it not been for his self-forged armor, his rib cage would have been slashed to pieces beneath that strike. Lionel's expression couldn't help but become several hints more serious. He had the advantage in strength, power, speed and even sharpness, but he was actually losing in combat effectiveness, experience and battle prowess. The Rapax appeared before Lionel instantly, not giving the latter any room to breathe. The Rapax leg soared into the skies, performing a perfect vertical split. Its momentum was so fierce as its axe kick descended that the ground around its plant leg cracked. Lionel swiped his spear at the Rapax plant leg, trying to throw it off balance before its kick could land. However, his tail countered before Lionel's spear could even gather up momentum, clashing strongly against the spear. The axe kick descended swiftly, the Rapax heel glowing with a blinding golden light like a shimmering guillotine. Even before it landed, Lionel could feel the sharpness digging into the skin of his forehead. He had no doubt that if this kick connected, his body would be split right down the middle. Without a choice, Lionel used the momentum of his clash against the Rapax tail to roll off to the side, just missing the downward axe kick by a small hair. Eggless novel C.O.M. boom. The ground split in 2 and the residual impact cracked the rest. Even so, the Rapax was completely unmoved and he pressed down toward Lionel again, and then again. The closer to death Lionel came, the calmer he became. Although he didn't have perfect control over his body like he did when he had his ability index, he still maintained perfect control over his mind. He realized that he needed to enter that state. He had cleared the first territory again. After he had gained power, he had let his brain take over the heavy lifting again. Since he could win through sheer power, his skill had become less important. This was actually the first time that Lionel was fighting against a spearman for obvious reasons. A spearman who was also a close-quarters combat expert like this Rapax was a whole other can of worms. He couldn't win this by taking this so casually. The Rapax could sense Lionel's gaze becoming sharper and sharper, so he pressed even harder. His own instincts were sharp enough to feel that something might change if he didn't end things as quickly as possible. Lionel's figure flickered. He had noticed another weakness of his movement. With his speed, he had never needed a dedicated movement technique, and that only became more so after his spatial force affinity shot up. But after this battle, he could see that the martial arts style of this Rapax seemed to be infused with a mysterious movement pattern that allowed him to press his advantage instantly. The more Lionel saw of it, the more he got used to it, until his cold gaze suddenly went entirely blank. Lionel planted a palm on the ground, holding his spear in his free hand as he pushed up into a handstand. His hips torqued and he twirled once, spinning out of the way of the Rapax young man's downward swinging spear before bending his elbow and pushing. He spun through the air and landed behind the Rapax back on his feet. Swift. Lionel's spear shot forward just as the Rapax's tail rose to block, but this time, a mysterious spear domain seemed to form around Lionel's spear rather than around his body, creating a vortex of spear force that deflected the spear and landed right on the Rapax's body. The Rapax managed to throw Lionel's spear a tiny bit off course, causing him to miss the vital point between his natural plate armor. Even so, the impact caused the Rapax's back to curl in an awkward direction and his figure flew into the distance, crashing through several trees. Lionel shot forward, appearing above the Rapax and piercing down. Scree! The Rapax released a war cry as he forcefully spun his to thrust his spear up toward Lionel. However, at that moment, Lionel met its gaze with a boundless confidence. One spear to connect the earth and skies. The Rapax felt his heart tremble when he heard these words. Lionel's voice seemed to have a magical tone to them that demanded his essence of meaning to be birthed into the world. Chapter 1863. Published at 16th of May 2023 12:25 and 39 seconds p.m. Chapter 1863. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1863. Edram Lionel's spear seemed to vanish. In its place, a line that connected the skies and earth appeared in its place, descending with the might of a smite from the heavens above. In that moment, just the smallest tinge of violet colored his golden spear, causing its power to skyrocket beyond realms of normal reason. When it crashed down, the Rapax realized that there was simply no blocking it. There was simply nothing he could do. Bang! Lionel's spear pierced through the Rapax's stomach and into the ground below, a sharp light that would be denied brightening the entire world. The flash was seen from dozens of kilometers away, opening the eyes of all those that looked up. Lionel descended with a heavy thud, landing over the Rapax. The white furs on his hermit-like armor and hood fluttered in the wind, but not a single thing seemed out of place even after the intense battle. Although Lionel had defeated the Rapax, he still looked down at him with hints of respect in his eyes. If not for their gap in power and strength due to the circumstances of the trial, it was uncertain if Lionel would be able to win this battle. Though this uncertainty was only due to the fact that Lionel didn't have his ability index, wasn't this Rapax restricted in the same way? Still looking the Rapax in the eye, Lionel bent forward and snatched his spear. "What's your name?" Lionel asked. Egglesnell the Rapax didn't seem to want to speak, but Lionel only shrugged. It was only a moment of curiously. He fused the two spears together and his became sturdier and sharper once again. There wasn't much of a change in its appearance since the first fusion, but Lionel could feel the changes quite profoundly. It had a bit of extra heft to it, its blade was a little longer, and whereas before Lionel had to rely on his spear force to pierce the hide of beasts, he could pierce them relying on his strength and the sharpness of this blade alone. Slowly, the Rapax began to shimmer away and vanish. But in the end, he did finally speak once more, maybe in gratitude for Lionel not killing him even though he very well could have. "My name is Urakai." Lionel looked down as the raypack slowly faded away and grinned. The name's Lionel Morales, don't dream about me too much. Train hard. Yurikai was immediately irritated, but it was already too late for him to get revenge. He could only strew in his own frustration. He, Yurikai, a genius among geniuses, had actually only managed to receive the lowest black grade reward in this tribulation. How pathetic. I'll remember you. I'll crush you with my full strength when next we meet. The cry of indignance echoed out, but Lionel only chuckled. This guy had been far too arrogant, he just wanted to knock him down a peg. Of course, Lionel hadn't realized that he had been just as arrogant, or maybe he felt that his own arrogance was only natural while everyone else were posers. Lionel retracted his spear and waved it a few times. He gave himself a nod before beginning to draw a force art into the ground. There weren't many beasts remaining in this zone, so he would clear them quickly. After he finished off 3 more, he would fuse his zones and allow the more powerful beasts to start spawning, only then would he begin to target more zones. Lionel realized what he needed most was a movement technique. He wasn't sure if the treasure zone Nelligan told him about would have won, but he would have to take a look. After reaching bronze clearance, Lionel would have certain other advantages that he could take advantage of, so he would have to make full use of them. As expected, Lionel quickly cleared the region. When this one was counted with his others, that made 6, plus the one that Yurikai had already claimed, and he had 7 total. He just had 3 more to go. Lionel flashed forward and quickly entered a new zone. He didn't meet anyone as powerful as Yurikai immediately and made quick work of the next 3 territories. All 3 had been headed by young geniuses who were still working on completing their first territory, so it went to show just what kind of gap there was between the participants of this tribulation. Although Lionel had many questions, he knew that he would likely have to wait to learn more about them. It couldn't be helped. The best he could do now was put his head down and grind. Lionel fused his now 10 territories. The force field that enveloped them rippled once before solidifying. Quickly, a surge of force rushed through and Lionel instantly began to hear the howls of much more powerful beasts. This time, Lionel didn't instantly draw a force art to attract them over, he wanted to see how strong they would be first. At that moment, in the tribulation zone, a pair of young men were meeting. "Oh, so it's you. I didn't expect our territories to be so close." In reply, the young man who spoke only received a snort. If Lionel was there, though he wouldn't recognize who these 2 young men were, he would recognize their races. One young man was handsome to an exaggerated degree. There wasn't a single imperfection on his tan skin. In fact, it felt like his tan was an illusion brought by the delicate bronze energy he gave off, almost as though the sun's rays couldn't help but cling onto him. His hair and irises shared the same radiant bronze color, and it made him look far more like a carved statue than a living being. There was no doubt that this young man was a spiritual. The other young man, the one who had snorted, was exceptionally handsome as well. He had a radiant glass orb in the center of his forehead, but he otherwise looked entirely human. Except for the 2 pairs of hands that floated around him. Despite being completely separate from his body, one would be certain at a glance that they were one and the same existence. This young man was without a doubt a member of the nomad race, a race of beings with 6 hands and yet just 2 arms. The young spiritual smiled and didn't seem bothered by the nomad's attitude at all. "In the end, it will always be the 6 of us. You, me, Alarina, Pririna, Kaldar and Yurikai, there's no need to fight now. I will see you to decide the champion in the end." With that, the young spiritual turned around and headed in the opposite direction, not crossing the nomad youth's barrier. But it was clear that there were more hints of amusement in his eyes than respect, almost as though he was a cat toying with a mouse. "Idrim, I will personally take your head," the nomad youth said coldly as he watched the spiritual youth walk away. In response, though, Idrim only laughed. It seemed that he didn't care in the slightest. To him, he had shown mercy. Wouldn't it be a shame if a genius like Anul only passed with black grade awards? Chapter 1864. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 4 seconds AM. Chapter 1864. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1864 Problems. Lionel sat on the back of an enormous rhino beast. It must have been the size of a small hill. At first glance, it wasn't even immediately obvious that it was a creature and looked more like a large patch of dried, gray land. However, the aura it radiated was a different matter entirely, especially considering the large crystal orb that Lionel held in his palm. Lionel looked at the crystal orb that was larger than his own head and laughed to himself. How was he supposed to eat this, exactly? He would just have to hope that cracking it wouldn't cause him to lose too much of its essence. Casually swinging his spear downward, Lionel shattered the crystal. Almost immediately, the energy began leaking out in all directions. Lionel sighed. It seemed that he wouldn't be so lucky. However, he didn't give up. With a large inhale, he tried to suck up everything he could. Without the ability to manipulate force outside of his spear force, this was the best he could do. Surprisingly, things worked out better than he thought they would. The force was ripped toward him along with the wind, flooding into his lungs. Lionel almost choked on the shards as they went down the wrong pipe, but luckily, when they entered his body, the shards dispersed into motes of energy, saving him from an embarrassing death. I really am too pathetic without my ability index. Lionel didn't know whether to laugh or cry. What a stupid mistake. That was the kind of mistake even a normal human wouldn't make, but he was so used to thinking at the speed of light that he was too confident in taking actions before he even finished his thought process all the way through. Lionel leapt up and nodded with satisfaction. He had finally cleared the evolved beasts in his new fused territory. It was about time he went hunting again. The next milestone was 100 for silver. He should be one of the first if not the first to reach a bronze standard, so he had to press his advantage and slaughter his way through a few more territories. The moment Lionel stepped out from his bubble, he found that there were actually a few options down this path, 3 to be exact. 2 looked quite normal in that they were also large forests with a density of beasts, exactly like all the territories he had conquered until now. The last one, however, had a different sort of aura to it, and Lionel could see a building in the far-off distance, likely located at its center. Without hesitation, Lionel took this third option. This should be one of the challenging territories Nelligan had spoken about. There were any number of rewards to gain from it, whether it was a new spear or spear technique or an auxiliary treasure that could help you in the tribulation. Lionel shot inside and streaked through the forest, keeping a sharp eye out for anything dangerous. Raffer Brazinger, the leader in name of the 4 Brazinger youths, was quite exasperated at the moment. The instant they returned to this place, a place that, quite frankly, they had all seen as their backyard, they had been ambushed by 7th-dimensional existences. Although they were geniuses in their own right, the gap between the 6th and 7th dimensions was far too great. Although this didn't mean that they were helpless against a 7th-dimensional existence, fighting in that situation would have only ended poorly for them. After all, if they caught up fighting one, what would they do when a 2nd or 3rd involved themselves? Under normal circumstances, Raffer would have taken the risk. After all, the moon wasn't too far away by the standard of their current means, so if they were attacked in such a fashion, help from their people shouldn't be far away. However, Raffer wasn't a fool. The fact that Earth had so boldly attacked made him feel that something was off. And, more oddly, the 7th-dimensional individuals that had surrounded them weren't normal. In fact, they could be classified as geniuses. Although they weren't nearly as good as the best the Brazinger had, compared to the batch they had sent out this time under their current restrictions, they were still extraordinary. Due to these factors, Raffer and the others had chosen to take the safer approach. But the moment they found themselves in a dilemma. Eggless novel COM. The airspace of Earth was completely monitored with what seemed like a force art on the scale Earth most definitely shouldn't have. They had no idea who could have possibly set up such a formation, but it made escaping Earth through the air nigh impossible. Due to this, their only option was teleportation, but after a few attempts, they realized that the formation also had very strong restrictive properties. By the time they finally gathered up enough materials to create a formation stronger than what Earth's force art could stop, they ran into yet another problem. The path to the moon was space-locked and would require even stronger materials than what they had. Without a choice, they could only change their destination to a settlement of the Aderna family. Only to run into even more problems. The team of 4 had only just vanished and appeared in a distant location within the Milky Way, but not only did they find a planet that was almost entirely barren where they should have found thriving civilization, but Sarathana, Raffer's elder and most silent sister, suddenly spoke. "We've been tracked," she said softly. The other 3 couldn't feel it, but she could. A force art drawn on a large enough scale to encompass an entire planet was difficult to make perfect unless a much higher dimensional existence went down in dimension to draw it. As such, it wasn't surprising that Earth's force art could be circumvented with the use of stronger materials. However, it was obvious that whoever had drawn it had known this, so rather than fighting the inevitable, they let it happen and tagged the teleportation of the 4 instead. Now they likely only had a few moments before they were hunted down once more. It was then that a familiar warp in space occurred and 4 blue-haired individuals appeared. Chapter 1865. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1865. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1865. Naivete. The 8 youths fell into silence as they looked toward one another, both of them quite haggard. They looked toward one another and seemed to have a moment of silent solidarity. It was clear at a glance that they had both just come from Earth and had both been harassed in much the same way. After a moment, the leader of the Aderna family looked around before her face was warped into a frown. This was definitely their base of operations. Why was it barren? No. It wasn't barren, it was destroyed. If Lionel was there, he would recognize this leader of the Aderna family. Although she had grown up, his senses would be too sharp to miss the similarities. This person was none other than little Nana, the very same little girl that Lionel had saved in the Camelot zone. Right now, though, there was nothing about little Nana that was little. She had already grown into her own, becoming quite a beautiful young woman. In fact, she and her brother beside her were both well into the 7th dimension, making them the only 2 with this level of strength present. Little Nana's elder brother was also a person that Lionel had met before back when he was first chasing the golden-scaled koi fish. He had returned Lionel's favor for saving his younger sister by blocking Simeon and the other 2 geniuses of the Crudis and Lavis families, and now he had also grown into his own. The Aderna family sent 2 7th-dimensional existences? Raffer asked, a hint surprised though his words also seemed to be implying something. It was very obvious to Raffer that the Aderna family would only do this if they knew something the Brazingers did not, and that was made even more obvious by the fact they had sent little Nana. Adrin was only at the level of Simeon and not worth Raffer's attention, much less Sarathana's. However, little Nana was a different case entirely. She was a genius even surpassing that of Raffer's elder sister and had a long track record to prove it. The only reason the Aderna family was even able to send her out was because she had already been in this world before when she was much younger. Little Nana's bind ability index allowed her to place restrictions on more than just the physical. As she had grown more skilled, she could even place restrictions on herself, allowing her to fool the eyes of the regulator and slip by without detection. However, even while restricted, her current power dwarfed them all, and that would be the case even if she was in the 6th dimension like the rest of them, let alone the fact she was in the 7th. Adrin started slowly, received a report a few months ago. Why did it take you so long to reply, then? We weren't here, Adrin replied, we were in another domain and had to come back to shore up things here. But it's clear that we were too late, and in pretty it happened to all of us. Someone wiped out our families to the last man. The message only said. Prince Lionel Morales. I don't believe it, Nana immediately shook her head. Adrin opened his mouth to reply, but in the end he shook his head and sighed. His little sister might be exceptionally powerful, but this was ironically exactly why she had been able to maintain her innocence even to this point. She didn't know what hardship was because everything was too easy, and everyone doted on her. The only hardship she had ever experienced in her life was in the Camelot zone, and it was ironically Lionel who had saved her from it, so just based on this, the place Lionel had in her heart was exceptional. What his little sister didn't realize, though, was the fact that even if Lionel had slaughtered them all, he wasn't necessarily in the wrong. Their families were encroaching on the people of Earth. Of course, things actually weren't so simple considering it was that lineage that had control over Earth. But as someone born and raised on Earth, it made no difference to Lionel. All he knew was that Emperor Fox was his grandfather and that this territory was his. The reasons the four great families had for being here were irrelevant to him. Since they had warred against Earth, there was no doubt that Lionel had lost some people he cared for, so it was only right for him to be infuriated and destroy them if he could. And since he had managed to come back from that place, given his talent, this kind of improvement was almost a given. However, in little Nana's naive little world, everyone she loved was always perfect. Whether it was the Aderna family or Lionel, both were in the right, so there had to be something else she didn't know about, and the two definitely wouldn't hurt one another. Having such a naive little girl wield such power, it was hard to tell if this was a good or a bad thing. Lionel Morales? Rafa repeated this name with a dark expression. However, almost the instant he did so, he regretted it. Rafa felt his body go entirely limp and out of his control. He couldn't even look toward the young woman pressuring him, because even looking up at this point was like lifting a mountain for no reward other than greater pressure. Nana. Adrin said softly. Hearing her big brother say something, little Nana snorted lightly and let the matter go. However, everyone else felt a helpless sort of cold sweat. Rafa hadn't even said anything bad about him yet, he had only repeated the name in a displeased tone, but it had still caused such a reaction. Egglesnell Rafa cleared his throat as he took deep breaths. Although he was inwardly furious, there was nothing else he could do. Lionel Morales was a name he knew only because it was tied to Aina Athelys Brazinger, and even more importantly than that half-breed was her traitorous father, Adam Rainier Brazinger. To think that such a person would actually dare destroy their bases. His name had already been placed on a sure kill list, but they hadn't been in a hurry as he wasn't worth that much concern. But now... Rafa's gaze flashed with a malevolent light. Chapter 1866. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1866. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1866. Ellerin Rafa took a breath and calmed himself. He was used to a hierarchy in the Brazinger family. Among the four they were most definitely the strictest in this regard. Since their bloodlines practically made them thirst for battle, it was an inevitable outcome. The likes of Simeon was exceptionally rare. If not for his background, he would have never been favored so much regardless of what his ability index could do. Long story short, Rafa was very much used to swallowing his pride and biding his time. He lacked top-tier talent within their family, so he could only do things this way. What should we do, then? Rafa asked. Just from our short stint on Earth, it was too easy to tell that their entire system has been overhauled. And now that we've left Earth, returning to our families will be difficult with this being this way. Earth was their only gateway back to their families, so now that they had been lured away in order to find out information about what had truly happened, there was no going back, at least not with any sort of ease. No matter how they looked at it, whoever had set them up like this had done so on purpose and also had an understanding of how their system worked. Now, unless they disregarded the risks and tried to rush back to Earth, they would definitely be delayed at least a few more months, extending matters even further. Obviously, this was the goal of Earth and it only benefited them. I think the first thing we should do is gather the others. We need to leave here quickly, as I'm sure you've all already sensed that we've been tagged. Since we've sent people, the Lavis and Critus definitely have as well. After we gather up, we can decide what the next step will be. Adrin replied. It'll be difficult. I doubt the tag only applied to those coming here, so they've been tagged as well. If they chose to flee from their location as quickly as possible, finding them might prove difficult. By then, they can pick us off one by one, Rafa said solemnly. Also, there's no guarantee that they sense seventh dimension existences like you did, so they might very well be sitting ducks. The four families couldn't exactly be said to be entirely cozy and buddy with one another. They were more like reluctant allies as they had no other choice. But this was enough for them to not want the unwarranted death of one another. It felt that given how things were stacked up against them, before they even found the others, they'd already long be dead. Your words make sense, Adrin nodded. In that case we should pivot. If we can meet up with them, that would be for the best, but since we cannot, I think the best course of action is to leave Earth's territory. After thinking for a while, Adrin came down with this conclusion. Everyone fell into silence. Although it was an uncomfortable truth, it was one nonetheless. Right now, they all felt trapped, like mice in a trap. If they squirmed about in Earth's territory for too long, they could suffer greatly for it in the end. Not necessarily, Raffer suddenly said with a smile. Since things have reached this point, I think it's best we move some things forward. Adrin frowned. It wasn't that he hadn't thought of this, but they didn't have the weight to make such a decision. In addition, with how suffocating Earth's tactics had been, there was no telling how those chess pieces were faring to begin with. We had a good opportunity when terrain attacked, but everything was ruined by that Lionel Morales, so we shut them down before they could act. I think it's only right that this Lionel Morales now becomes the trigger for the opposite, Raffer said lightly, shivering slightly under Nana's warning glance. I'm not certain that. There's no better time than now, we can't delay any longer, Raffer cut off Adrin. Think about it clearly. Our families have been wiped out and all the time we've spent building up our foundation has been wasted. Although we don't have the jurisdiction to know why our families are doing this, it's apparent that they have their reasons, correct? If not, why even bother? Why not just wait until Earth enters the 8th dimension and send in the geniuses of your younger sister's caliber? What chance would Earth stand then? Adrin fell into silence. Raffer's words made sense. There was definitely a reason they needed to establish a presence first, and he felt that it was likely due to the necessity of not allowing the fox to grow freely. If we let things get too out of hand, reversing the situation would be impossible. It's time we activate some trump cards and counters. Silence fell over them all once again before Adrin took a breath. He was a fool, he could see the ambition in Raffer's eyes. His words were logical, but they were underpinned by an insatiable desire to prove himself. It was clear that Raffer saw this as an opportunity to increase both his and his sister's station in life. Adrin no longer needed to press so hard, his little sister had already led their branch family far further than he could ever imagine. But he could understand Raffer's fire because he had once had it as well, before his little sister matured. He didn't know when that fire vanished, but he had just become okay with letting little Nana take the reins. He just felt that there were other things worth fighting for. But now... All right. Let's contact Ellerin, then. Adrin said firmly. Deep within Earth's territory, on a planet that was filled with lush greenery and wild beasts, but without a hint of civilization, a young man reclined within a tall tree's shadow. He seemed to be at complete peace, a rusted machete by his side, until his eyes suddenly snapped open, revealing a piercing blue depth. Eagles Nova 1. Oh, this young man had features carved from a painting. Eyes as blue as the skies, hair as white and pure as winter's first snowfall, and delicate brown skin that reminded one of gently roasted nuts. Every one of his actions exuded an air of vitality and suffocating pressure. This young man was Ellerin. The young man who cleared the zones of Earth the second fastest. Hacker Hutch's grandson. Chapter 1867. Published at 19th of May 2023 10:27 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1867. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1867. Deneglesnivel C. Lionel took a deep breath, causing the surrounding air to rush toward him again. All around him, the strewn corpses of armored knights lay. Though they didn't leak any of their own blood, the cracks and joints of their armor leaked out plumes of force. Unfortunately, Lionel couldn't absorb this like he could the beast crystals. He had already tried. Up ahead, there was just one knight that remained. His spear was so tall and mighty that it was at least 50% taller than him, who already stood over 2 meters tall to begin with. On top of that, its blade was of an exaggerated size and shape, taking up an entire third of its body. At first glance, it looked far more like a lance than a spear. The difference was that rather than having a cone shape, it had 4 blades perfectly perpendicular to one another, almost looking like the extended head of a mace. The knight rose from his throne as Lionel approached, plumes of force jetting out from the joints in its sapphire blue armor. Lionel exhaled one more breath and he had already recovered to 100%, his body feeling loose and limber. He didn't know what reward lay at the end of this castle, but clearing it had taken as much time as it had for him to gather up 10 territories to begin with, on top of clearing the more elite beasts. He hoped that whatever he got in return would be good. All thoughts were thrown to the back of his mind as his gaze became frighteningly cold. With a step, he moved just as the Blue Knight moved, however his brows couldn't help but jump the instant the latter did. The Blue Knight was fast. Extraordinarily fast. Although Lionel had moved first, he had actually attacked a step late. While he had expected some difficulty in the final hurdle, Lionel had thought that the greater part of the challenge was already behind him only because of the sheer number of enemies. It seemed like he had been wrong. Lionel realized that it was too late to continue attacking, so his stance shifted and his wrists flicked upward, nicking the underside of the Blue Knight's enormous mace-like lance spear. Ducking with a bend of his knees, Lionel slid under the violently piercing blade, his feet gliding along the marbled floors of the throne room. Forceful. Lionel's spear spiraled through the air, forming its own lance-like construct as his absolute spear domain wrapped around it and collided with the Blue Knight's chest plate armor. Clang. Ban. The Blue Knight stumbled just a single step backward, but it had already raised its spear upward, swinging it down as though it was a club rather than a spear, even to the point of using just a single arm. Lionel rolled to the side, just barely dodging. However, he was calm as he sprung back up to his feet, gliding back to dodge another strike. Inwardly, though, he was confused. Logically, his spear should have done much more damage. For one, his spear had been upgraded to the bronze grade after fusing 10 territories. Secondly, he had used forceful, the strongest strike he could utilize in such close quarters and with such short notice. And yet, he had only left a dent on the armor. Lionel dodged again as he sent a look toward his spear. This time, his expression changed a little when he noticed the micro-fractures fissuring its body. The good news was that these fractures slowly healed, likely because this tribulation wasn't cruel enough to leave a participant spearless in the case of an accident. The bad news was that this pretty much guaranteed that Lionel wouldn't be able to break down these defenses with normal means. He had been through this castle for long enough. Attacking the joints wouldn't help. Only by causing enough damage to the armor itself could he cause a knockdown and victory. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he stamped his foot down hard, unleashing a roar. The marbled floors cracked once as he launched himself forward. Backtracking wouldn't help him, the only path forward was to push, relentlessly. The Blue Knight had exceptional straight-line speed, but Lionel had already realized that its agility was lacking and things were only made worse by the heft of its spear. He had to stay close, unleashing barrage after barrage. Lionel glided around the Blue Knight, his tactics changing as his eyes glazed over. His spear left countless afterimages in the air, delicate brushes of gold painting the throne room in a nobility beyond anything it had experienced before. Faster. Faster. The white furs that coated Lionel's body fluttered, dancing into the coarse wings as his body only seemed to become more and more agile. His spear danced, clashing against the blue armor again and again. Not working, change tactics, layer strikes. Lionel's body moved faster than his thoughts. He followed up, slow, strikes with accelerated strikes, giving the illusion that he was layering 2 attacks into one, and then 3 into one, and then 4. Bang! 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 Not fast enough. The number of loud clashes began to lessen, and then they lessened again. Eventually, Lionel moved so fast and skillfully that the layered spear strikes echoed as one, making it seem as though he had only struck out with his spear just a single time. Lionel's gaze flashed with a blazing light and he suddenly felt his spear techniques evolve. His spear domain lineage factor shifted, touching upon a barrier that felt far more ethereal than what it had before. Lionel tried to burst through and just barely failed, however the feeling of euphoria gripped his soul. This time, Lionel truly only pierced his spear forward just a single time, and yet the Blue Knight felt as though it had suffered 3 strikes at once. Bang! The armor dented. Bang! The dent deepened. Bang! The armor was torn through like thin aluminum, Lionel's spear shooting right through like a blazing meteor. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.